Welcome back to Horror Stories for Sleep with Rain, Volume 4. Be prepared to sleep with a cozy ambient and an amazing story compilation to be scared. Please subscribe and let's begin. The town of Elmont sat on a cliff's edge, perched above an ocean so black it seemed to drink the light from the sky. I had come to this forsaken place chasing an inheritance, a decrepit manor my late uncle had left me in his will. The letter had arrived without warning, its words scrawled in a trembling hand I barely recognized. "Come to Elmont," it read. "The house is yours now. Beware the tide." I thought it a strange warning, but curiosity and desperation outweighed my caution. I was between jobs, drowning in debts, and the promise of property, even in a forgotten corner of the world, was too tempting to ignore. I arrived under a slate-gray sky, the air heavy with salt and decay. The manor loomed at the edge of the cliffs, its silhouette jagged against the horizon. The town itself was lifeless, its streets empty save for a few shuttered windows and the occasional glimpse of a pale face retreating into the shadows. The house was worse than I had imagined. Its walls leaned as though bowed by an unseen weight, and the windows were dark, their glass opaque with grime. As I stepped inside, the floor groaned beneath my weight, the air thick with mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. The letter had promised a caretaker, but there was no sign of anyone. Instead, I found the key hanging from a nail in the foyer, tied with a black ribbon. The interior was a labyrinth of narrow halls and slanted rooms, filled with furniture that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. That night, as I lay in the only bed that didn't collapse under my weight, I heard it for the first time, a deep, resonant sound like the tolling of a distant bell. It came from the direction of the ocean, rhythmic and deliberate, each note sending a shiver through the house. I peered out the window, but the cliffs were shrouded in mist, the ocean below invisible. Still the sound persisted, echoing in my bones until sleep finally claimed me. In the morning I ventured into town, hoping to find someone who could explain the strange noises. The few people I encountered were reluctant to speak, their eyes darting to the cliffs whenever I mentioned the sound. "Leave before the tide comes in," an old man muttered, his voice trembling. "They don't like strangers." "Who doesn't?" I asked, but he only shook his head and hurried away. As the day wore on, I began to notice the peculiarities. The people here didn't blink. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though they were moving through water, and their eyes, dark and reflective, seemed to follow me even when their heads did not. That night, the sound returned, louder this time, and with it came the dreams. I was standing on the cliffs, staring into the abyssal ocean. The water churned and writhed as though alive, its surface breaking apart to reveal something massive beneath. An eye, larger than the manor, staring directly at me. I woke drenched in sweat, the sound of the tolling bell still ringing in my ears. Desperate for answers, I began searching the house, scouring its every corner for some clue about my uncle's life here. In the attic, I found his journal. The entries began innocuously enough. Observations about the weather, notes on the house's repairs, and complaints about the isolation. But as the pages went on, his words grew erratic, his handwriting frantic. "They call from the depths," he wrote. "Their voices are in the tide, their whispers in the foam. They demand a sacrifice." The last entry was a single sentence, scrawled across the page in trembling letters. "Beware the tide." That night, the tolling bells were joined by a new sound, a wet, slithering noise that seemed to come from the cliffs. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed my belongings and fled toward the town, hoping to find refuge or at least answers. But the streets were empty, the doors locked, and the windows boarded. As I approached the cliffs, the sound grew deafening, a cacophony of tolling bells and guttural roars. The ocean churned violently, the mist parting to reveal something rising from the depths. It was impossible to comprehend. A mass of writhing tentacles and chitinous limbs, its form shifting and fracturing as though reality itself rejected its presence. The townspeople emerged from the shadows, their faces blank and their movements synchronized as they marched toward the cliffs. They began to chant, their voices blending with the tolling bells. I tried to run, but my legs refused to move. The air grew thick, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. The creature's gaze turned toward me, its eye filled with a malice that burned through my soul. The townspeople surrounded me, their hands cold and damp as they dragged me toward the edge of the cliffs. They were chanting words I couldn't understand, their voices harmonizing with the creature's guttural roars. At the last moment I broke free, stumbling backward and tumbling down a narrow path that led to the shore. The creature's roar shook the ground, but it didn't follow. I don't remember how I escaped, only that I woke up miles away, the tolling bells still echoing in my mind. Now I am far from Elmont, but the dreams remain. Every night I see the cliffs, the ocean, and the eye, and every morning I wake to the faint sound of bells in the distance, a reminder that some horrors cannot be escaped. If you ever hear the tide tolling, turn away. Some doors should never be opened.
The next story you're about to hear is based on a real-life story that many of you know. Vampires? Do you hear about them? If not, you're going to. The autumn winds howled through the ancient hills of Hungary, carrying whispers of forgotten legends. The year was 1897, and the long, winding path to the manor was shrouded in mist as Jonathan Harker traveled deeper into the heart of the Carpathian Mountains. With each rattling clatter of his carriage wheels, the unease in his chest grew. He tightened his coat against the chill, glancing nervously at the trees that seemed to claw at the passing darkness. A letter from his fiancée, Mina, crumpled in his pocket, the ink smudged from the sweat of his palm. He had read it countless times, a small comfort during the perilous journey. Yet now, the words seemed distant, almost otherworldly. Dracula, he muttered under his breath, the name heavy as lead. The carriage pulled to a halt before an imposing stone edifice, the castle of Count Dracula. Its jagged silhouette cut a grotesque figure against the moon, and for a moment, Jonathan wondered if he had not reached the threshold of another world, a place where the laws of man no longer held sway. The doors creaked open, revealing a darkened foyer draped in shadow. He stepped out, the chill seeping into his bones, and was met by a figure whose presence seemed to devour the light. Count Dracula stood there, eyes gleaming with an unsettling familiarity. "Welcome to my home, Mr. Harker," the Count's voice, deep and lilting, echoed through the great hall. His gaze was steady, fixed, and Jonathan felt a shiver skitter down his spine. They exchanged pleasantries, and Jonathan's polite responses were met with a keen interest that bordered on obsession. Dracula's words were measured, careful, as if each syllable was part of an elaborate game. As they sat at a grand dining table, candles flickering, the Count poured wine that glistened like blood in the dim light. The taste was metallic, sharp, and Jonathan forced himself to swallow. They spoke of England, of the real estate the Count sought, and of the strange beauty of the unknown. But as the conversation deepened, the air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Dracula's eyes followed Jonathan with a predatory glint, a hunger that was impossible to name. Later, when Jonathan retired to his chamber, he could not shake the feeling of being watched. The cold moonlight spilled through the window, cutting silver lines across the room. A sudden knock at the door made him jump, his heart thundering like a war drum. It was the Count. "Mr. Harker, I trust you are comfortable," Dracula said, his voice smooth as silk, yet sharp as a blade. The room felt smaller, the shadows pressing in. "Yes, thank you, Count," Jonathan managed, his voice tight. Dracula's smile did not reach his eyes. "There is something in this place that does not sleep, Jonathan. You will find that you are not alone." With that, he left, and Jonathan was left staring into the echo of silence. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and dread. The castle's vast corridors were like veins, winding and pulsing with an ancient, unseen life. Jonathan would hear the faintest of sounds, whispers behind doors, the rustle of fabric in the dark. Shadows seemed to move with a will of their own, shifting in and out of sight. One night, as the wind howled outside, Jonathan's own hand was cut open, a brief but sharp pain searing his palm. The blood welled up, hot and red, and before he could move, he felt the presence behind him. He turned, heart seizing in his chest, to find Dracula standing there, eyes wide and unblinking, his lips quivering with a strange hunger. "Forgive me," the Count whispered, though his voice was no more than a rasp. "But blood, it calls." Jonathan recoiled, the room spinning, but Dracula simply bowed his head and left, leaving behind an air that crackled with something malignant and alive. It was then that Jonathan knew the darkness within the castle was not just the absence of light, but the embodiment of something older, something with a pulse and a will. The days passed, and Jonathan's body grew weaker, his reflection in the mirror growing paler, more hollow with each passing hour. And then, one evening, as twilight crept across the land, he stumbled upon a sound that made him stop dead in his tracks. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers against stone. He traced the noise down a narrow passage, and as he stepped into the flickering glow of torchlight, he found himself in a room unlike any other. It was small, with vaulted ceilings, and the walls were adorned with carvings, symbols that seemed to shift when he blinked. At the center stood one of Dracula's brides, her eyes wide, her expression unreadable. The air seemed to thrum, and Jonathan's pulse quickened. "You're not the first to see this," she whispered, her voice like the wind through dry leaves. "But you may be the last." Suddenly, the castle shuddered, a low groan resonating through the stone. The night outside split with a crack of thunder, and Jonathan knew, deep in his soul, that whatever this place hid was about to be revealed. As the castle trembled, the stones vibrating beneath his feet, Jonathan staggered forward, clutching the edge of the stone altar in front of him. The bride's eyes locked with his, and there was something in their depths, an understanding, a warning, that made his blood run cold. "Run," she whispered, almost too faint to hear over the noise. But he didn't move. His limbs were heavy, bound by terror and the unrelenting weight of dread that pressed down on his chest. From the shadows, a low, guttural growl reverberated, and he turned to see the Count, standing at the threshold of the chamber, his form stretched and contorted, as if trying to contain something monstrous inside. The pale, angular face that had once seemed so inviting now held only a brutal, predatory hunger. "You have seen too much, Jonathan," Dracula said, his voice deep and resonant, yet tainted by an otherworldly rasp. His lips parted, revealing teeth that seemed longer, sharper than before. "And now you will know what it means to be a part of this." Jonathan's heart was a wild, panicked drumbeat as he stumbled backward, away from the grotesque figure advancing toward him. He glanced over his shoulder, seeking an escape route, but the walls of the room seemed to close in, the symbols carved into the stone glowing with a sickly green hue. The air felt thick, heavy with an electric charge that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Before he could decide on a course of action, the bride stepped forward, blocking his path, her eyes wide and fearful. "He will kill you if you don't flee," she said, her voice trembling. The Count halted, tilting his head as if considering her words. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the wind that howled outside, clawing at the ancient stone. Then, as if dismissing any notion of hesitation, Dracula let out a laugh that chilled Jonathan to the bone. A sound like cracked glass and the shattering of old bones. Jonathan lunged to the side, past the bride, and bolted down the corridor, the stone floors cold underfoot. The castle seemed alive, shifting and groaning, as though it were trying to keep him from escaping. He darted through a labyrinth of hallways, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, eyes darting between the flickering light and the dark, unending corridors. Behind him, footsteps echoed, rhythmic and relentless, as if some unseen force were hunting him. He dared not look back, but every instinct in his body screamed that Dracula was close, the sound of his pursuit almost as palpable as the wind's howl. He burst into what appeared to be an abandoned chapel, the wooden pews dust-covered and warped, and the altar at the far end shrouded in a dim, unnatural glow. His eyes caught a glint of metal, a crucifix, left forgotten, its silver catching the candlelight. Desperate, he snatched it up and pressed it to his chest. For a heartbeat, there was silence, and then a deep, primal roar that shook the very stones of the castle. Dracula was here. Jonathan backed away as the Count materialized at the entrance, eyes aglow with a feral, inhuman light. The dark, ancient eyes that had first met his now seemed to have taken on the lifeless, cold quality of stone. The room filled with an impossible silence, the stillness pressing against him as though the world had paused. And then, in a flash, Dracula moved, faster than a human eye could track. Jonathan's scream was swallowed by the night as the Count's fingers wrapped around his wrist, pulling him close. The air grew colder, the light dimming as if the castle itself were holding its breath. Jonathan's pulse raced, the fear overwhelming him as the Count leaned forward, the sharpness of his fangs casting eerie glints in the dim light. "Jonathan Harker," Dracula said, his voice the faintest whisper, heavy with dark promises. "You will become a part of me." A cold, sharp pain shot through his arm, as if fire had been poured into his veins. Jonathan's vision dimmed, the room spinning as darkness pressed in, claiming him. Just as the last shreds of his consciousness slipped away, he caught sight of the bride, her face now pale and full of sorrow, and for a moment, he thought he heard her voice, whispering, "Forgive me." The world went black. The chill of the stone floor was a cruel reminder that Jonathan's body was still in the castle, still bound to this place that reeked of decay and death. His senses flickered to life, the sharp tang of blood and the metallic scent of old iron in the air making him gag. The agony in his arm was an endless, pulsing throb that reverberated through his entire being. Yet, there was a strange stillness within him now, as if a dark river had taken him, carrying him far from the shores of reason and hope. He tried to move, but the weight of his limbs seemed suffocated, shackled to the ground. The floor beneath him felt cold and rough, each stone as unyielding as the silence that filled the chamber. His vision was blurred, the edges of the room splintered into darkness that shivered with movement. It was then that he realized the whispers were not a figment of his mind but the soft murmurs of the castle itself, an ancient, almost sentient sound that resonated through the stone and into the marrow of his bones. A noise, faint but unmistakable, reached him from the hallway. It was the sound of hurried footsteps, coming toward him with a sense of urgency that spurred him to fight against the shackles of his own body. He blinked, desperately trying to focus, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure. A woman, moving with the grace of one who knew every shadow of the castle, who belonged to its dark heart. It was Mina. Mina, his voice, when it emerged, was little more than a rasp, a broken plea that carried none of the strength he had known before. He tried to call out to her, but his throat was dry, his voice caught in a rattle of breath. Mina's eyes locked with his, a blend of determination and dread. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering just above his face, as if afraid to touch him. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice cracking, but there was a flicker of life in her expression. "I found you." He tried to speak, but his words were tangled in the pain that seemed to wrap around him like a vice. His limbs began to respond, quivering with a new, desperate energy, but it wasn't enough to break free. The dark behind her eyes grew deeper, more suffocating, and for the briefest of moments, she glanced at the wound on his arm, now nothing more than a red, festering mark. Did you see him?" Jonathan managed, the words tasting of iron and ash. The room seemed to tilt and sway with the rhythm of the castle's breath, the silence between them deafening in its weight. Mina's lips pressed into a thin line, the corners of her mouth twitching as though resisting a shudder. He knows that we're trying to stop him." Her gaze flitted to the shadows at the edge of the room, a nervous tremble in her shoulders. The sound of distant, shuffling footsteps echoed, and the subtle jangle of metal scraping against stone brought forth a shiver. "The others?" Jonathan rasped, his pulse hammering in his ears. He needed to know. He needed to understand if the others were still safe. They're holding on," Mina said, the lie evident in the tremble of her voice. The air grew colder, an unnatural frost seeping from the walls. Jonathan's heartbeat quickened as the sound of laughter, hollow and dark, unfurled from the darkness at the far end of the room. It was a sound that made his bones ache and his vision blur. He turned to see a figure moving forward, tall, slender, and surrounded by an otherworldly presence that made the air crackle with dread. Dracula. A voice, deep and impossibly powerful, spoke, its words stretching like a dark shroud through the chamber. So, we meet again, Jonathan Harker. And now, you will truly understand the nature of what you've become. Mina's hand closed around Jonathan's, fingers tightening, but the warmth of her touch was already fading, the skin beneath her fingertips as cold as death. Jonathan fought to keep his eyes on her, but the pain surged, pulling him under, tearing away what little hope he had left. Dracula's shadow, long and twisted, crept across the floor like an extension of his own will, spreading out like the roots of a terrible tree. It moved with the grace of a predator, every step filled with an almost playful malice. As he stepped forward, the flickering light revealed the grotesque beauty of his face, the sickly perfection that hid the abyss within. "Welcome," he said, the word dripping with venom, "to your new existence." Mina lunged forward, her eyes locked with his. "Leave him alone," she shouted, her voice a defiance that burned through the cold and the silence. Dracula tilted his head, a sharp grin forming as he observed her, a hunger as ancient as time itself flickering in his gaze. "Oh, I'm afraid he's already mine," he replied, stepping closer to Jonathan, whose vision was growing dim, the edges of his sight blurring as the room tilted and the whispers returned, growing louder, chanting a dark refrain. Mina's scream split the silence, but it was too late. Darkness enveloped them all, and the castle shuddered, holding its breath as the fate of the room sealed itself with a sound like bone cracking. The room seemed to pulse, the walls shaking with a feral power that sent ripples through the stone, dislodging dust and making the torches sputter and flare. Jonathan's vision was an unending blur, the light of the flickering flames casting long, jagged shadows that leaped across the chamber. The whispers grew louder, sharper, and more insistent, threading themselves into his mind like a serpent seeking entry. Mina's voice, fierce and unyielding, pierced through the chaos. "You won't take him. Not while I breathe." Her figure loomed above him, half lit by the pale, trembling light. He could see the defiance in her eyes, the way she stood her ground even as the room trembled beneath their feet. But it was too late. The creature had already reached out, its cold, long fingers grazing Jonathan's brow. Jonathan gasped, the breath stolen from his lungs as the darkness surged into him, curling around his consciousness like a vice. He tried to scream, but his voice was trapped, a hollow echo that reverberated in the back of his throat. His body fought against the invasion, muscles straining, blood racing, but there was no strength left. A wave of icy dread washed over him, the weight of his own helplessness pressing down until his limbs turned to lead. "Jonathan," Mina whispered, her eyes wide and wet with fear and desperation. The floor underfoot cracked, splintered as though the castle itself was resisting what was happening. But Dracula did not stop. He was already drawing closer, the hunger in his eyes deepening with every heartbeat. Suddenly, there was movement from the doorway. Sister Agatha appeared, her silhouette framed by the shifting shadows. The glint of silver in her hand caught the torchlight, and the weapon she held was unmistakable, a stake, sharp and unforgiving. Her presence filled the chamber with a new energy, fierce and determined. "Back away, Count." Agatha's voice was a battle cry, a challenge thrown into the wind that carried with it all the power of faith and resolve. The Dark Prince turned, his expression a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "And who are you to defy me?" he hissed, the words dark tendrils that seemed to coalesce in the air between them. His gaze shifted to the weapon in Agatha's hand, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, an understanding that this was no ordinary adversary. "I am the one who will end you," Agatha declared, and with a sudden surge of strength, she lunged forward, the stake aimed at the heart of the beast. But before she could make contact, Dracula moved faster than thought, his form shifting from man to shadow and back, a sickening display of power that sent her sprawling to the ground. The stake clattered across the floor, landing inches from where she lay. The castle shuddered again, a groaning sound that seemed to come from its very foundation. Jonathan's eyes fluttered, the edges of his vision spiraling as the room seemed to melt into a strange, stifling darkness. Mina's scream, a raw and primal sound, cut through him, and in that moment, his soul felt as though it had been torn asunder. "Jonathan," Mina cried, reaching for him, but her touch was blocked by a wall of impenetrable darkness. Her eyes, wide with terror and love, met his one last time before the shadows consumed her. Dracula turned back to him, a wicked smile creeping across his face. The power in his eyes sparked, a crimson light that seemed to hold the weight of all the horrors the night could conjure. He raised his hand, and with a swift motion, the shadow around him deepened, growing claws that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the room. Jonathan's body went rigid, unable to move, unable to resist. But then, just as the darkness threatened to take him entirely, a different light filled the room, a glow as bright as the morning sun, slicing through the veil of shadows. The sound of 1,000 voices, chanting in unison, surged with it, and the walls of the castle began to burn, a white-hot blaze that seemed to banish every trace of the night's horrors. Dracula howled, the sound a terrible, shuddering thing that reverberated through the stones. His form twisted and stretched, the elegance of his face splitting apart into something monstrous, an abomination at the heart of the night. But even as he fought against the light, his power began to wane, the shadows faltering as the blaze spread. "Agatha," Jonathan whispered, barely conscious, his strength a whisper in the storm. But before he could call out again, the flames surged higher, and Dracula's scream was cut short as the fire consumed him, tearing him away like a scream lost to the wind. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the battle that had come before. Jonathan's mind spun, the pain in his arm no longer a burning agony but a dull throb, like the final heartbeat of a dead man. The castle, though still dark and twisting, seemed quieter now, as if waiting for something else to come, something hidden in the farthest shadows. Sister Agatha, bruised and blooded, picked up the stake and looked at Jonathan, her face a portrait of exhaustion and relief. "The battle is far from over," she said, her voice steady as the embers in the room died down. "But for now, we have won." Jonathan's eyes met hers, his own heart catching in the shifting light. The fight for life, for survival, was far from over. But tonight, there was a flicker of hope, small and fragile, but there nonetheless. The castle's halls were still, almost as if they were holding their breath, waiting for the next movement, the next sound. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind blackened stone walls that exhaled heat in suffocating waves. The night outside remained cloaked in darkness, with only the occasional cry of a distant bird breaking the silence, an eerie sound that seemed to mock the terror that had just passed. Jonathan sat on the edge of an old wooden chair, its carvings now splintered and scorched, the remnants of a battle he could scarcely comprehend. Sister Agatha moved around the room, the faded grey of her habit streaked with dirt and blood. Her eyes were sharp, searching the shadows for movement, for a sign of the Count's return. "Is it over?" Jonathan whispered, each word a fragile thread. Agatha looked at him, her face illuminated by the flickering glow of a lantern that had survived the fire. "Dracula may be vanquished, but his reach extends far beyond these walls. His followers, those who are not yet dead, will come. We have only a brief reprieve." Jonathan's heart sank as the realization settled over him. He had seen the Count in his most monstrous form, a creature with eyes as deep and hollow as the void, and he understood now that the night was far from its conclusion. Whatever had been summoned by the darkness within the castle had not been destroyed. It had only been repelled, like an ancient, wounded beast waiting for its chance to strike again. "Do we have time to rest?" he asked, the exhaustion dragging at his limbs, pulling him into the shroud of despair. Agatha shook her head. "Rest will come only when the last of the dark power is extinguished. For now, we move. Mina is still out there, and if the Count has his way, she will be the key to everything." The sound of her name in Agatha's voice cut through him like a blade, fresh and raw. Mina, the woman he had promised to protect, who had suffered and fought and now stood at the edge of the unknown. The memory of her eyes, filled with a love that had once been pure, a love now tainted by terror and shadow, made his chest ache with a grief that felt like an open wound. "I must find her," Jonathan said, standing with a sudden, fierce determination. The room tilted, spinning like a topsy-whirled, but he pushed through it, leaning heavily on the edge of the table for support. "Jonathan, you're not in a state to," Agatha began. but he cut her off with a glare that held all the weight of desperation. "I don't care. I will find her, and I will bring her back. If the Count dares to take her, then he will face the wrath of a man who has nothing left to lose." For a moment, Agatha said nothing, the silence between them a battle of wills. But then she nodded, eyes glinting with a determination of her own. "Then we go. But we go prepared. There is an old library beneath this castle, a place untouched by time. If there is any knowledge left to be found, it will be there." Jonathan's chest tightened with both hope and dread. What could they possibly learn in the belly of this fortress that might help them? Yet, the thought of standing still was worse than the fear of what they might find. He nodded and followed her as she moved towards the shadows, a faintly carved torch in her hand. The flames wavered as they walked, casting long, distorted figures that seemed to reach for them, hungry and waiting. The corridors were cold, far colder than the main halls, and the air seemed to twist around them, thick with the scent of damp stone and something metallic. The walls closed in, whispering in a language older than man, as if the castle itself were a living, breathing entity that resented their intrusion. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became, each step a thundering echo that taunted them with the knowledge that they were not alone. Suddenly, Agatha paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked to the left. In the dim light, Jonathan saw what she had spotted, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, partially obscured by the darkness. Its form was lean, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular. A figure that looked as though it had been carved from the night itself. "Stay behind me," Agatha whispered, raising the stake as if it were a weapon against the dark. The creature stepped forward, its eyes glowing with a greenish hue that mirrored the faint light of the torches. It was no vampire, at least not one Jonathan had ever seen. Its face was more human than beast, yet its features twisted into a grotesque parody of a man, as if it were a shadow trying to mimic a life it could never attain. "Come no closer," Agatha warned, her voice steady, yet Jonathan noticed the slight tremble in her fingers. He could not blame her. The creature was fear made flesh, a thing of nightmares that clawed at the edges of reality. The creature's mouth opened, revealing fangs that dripped with a dark, glistening fluid. "You have come for the one who was taken," it rasped, its voice thin and brittle, yet dripping with malice. "You will find only death." Agatha's eyes met Jonathan's for a fleeting moment, and he saw the unspoken understanding in them. Whatever this thing was, it was the first of many challenges they would face. And if they did not defeat it, there would be no Mina to save. "Not today," Agatha said, and with a sudden burst of movement, she lunged forward, driving the stake into the creature's chest. A sound that was part scream, part hiss escaped its throat as it shuddered, its body convulsing as if caught in the throes of an invisible flame. But instead of collapsing, it drew back, letting out a rasping laugh that echoed in the stone hall, a sound that would haunt Jonathan for the rest of his life. With a final, strangled cry, the creature dissolved into mist, leaving only the faint scent of ash and the cold touch of a breeze in its wake. Jonathan's heart thudded in his chest, the silence that followed almost deafening. "What in God's name was that?" he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. Agatha exhaled slowly, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "The first of many, Jonathan. And now, we must find Mina before it's too late." The air seemed to thicken around them, pressing down like an invisible hand. Jonathan's mind spun with what had just happened, the creature's grotesque form seared into his memory. The echo of its voice, that dreadful laugh, still reverberated in the darkness. He took a shaky breath, trying to dispel the terror that gnawed at him, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the darkness itself were leeching the strength from his body. Agatha, unyielding in her resolve, moved forward, her eyes scanning the corridors as if the walls themselves were preparing to close in. They were no longer in the main part of the castle but had descended into the deeper levels, into the maze of stone and shadow that had once been sealed off from the rest of the world. This was where secrets were kept, where the blood of generations had been spilled in silence. "Stay close," Agatha said, her voice tight. "Whatever that thing was, it was not a stray. The castle has eyes and ears. We need to be careful." Jonathan swallowed hard, nodding, but the sight of his own reflection in the cracked glass of a nearby mirror made him pause. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, the skin beneath them shadowed with exhaustion. He had been through too much already, and yet the feeling of something lurking just beyond the edge of the torchlight made the hair on his neck rise. "Do you hear that?" Agatha's voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it cut through the gloom like a knife. Jonathan strained to listen, the silence so profound it felt like a tangible entity. But there, just barely audible, a faint, rhythmic sound reached his ears. Thumping, the pace of something heavy moving along the stone. His heart clenched in terror as they both turned to follow the noise down a narrow corridor. The stone walls seemed to close in tighter, the air colder. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows that made the hallway twist and shudder like living things. It was then that they saw it. A figure hunched at the far end of the hall, a silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of a gas lamp. Its head was bowed, and its shoulders were stooped as though burdened by an unbearable weight. "Who? What is that?" Jonathan muttered, fear creeping into his voice. Agatha didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a small silver crucifix from around her neck and held it out, its light casting a narrow band of pale brightness that cut through the dark. The figure stopped moving, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then, it lifted its head, revealing eyes that glistened with an unnatural, inhuman shine. It was a man, if the word could be used to describe it. His flesh was taut over his bones, with patches of it peeling like melted wax. He had a twisted, malformed mouth that seemed to stretch too wide, filled with sharp teeth that glistened in the pale light. "Run," Agatha whispered, but it was too late. The creature lunged forward, moving faster than humanly possible. Its limbs bent in grotesque angles, its stride a sickening, jerky dance. Jonathan's heart leaped into his throat as he stumbled back, his mind screaming at him to move. He grabbed Agatha's arm, pulling her as they dashed for an archway to the side, but the creature was relentless, its claws slashing the air behind them with a wet, ripping sound. They barely made it through the archway, Jonathan's pulse pounding as he dragged Agatha forward, crashing into an old study that had once been used by the monks who had lived in the castle long before it had become Dracula's fortress. Dust lay thick on the floor, and ancient tomes sat on the shelves, half decayed and covered in the mold of age. A cold, musty scent filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Agatha staggered against a bookshelf, clutching at her side where a deep gash had appeared, a thin line of blood trailing down her habit. Jonathan's chest heaved as he surveyed the room, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. His eyes landed on an old, rusted sword on the wall, its blade dull but still wickedly sharp. He grabbed it without hesitation, swinging it experimentally as the creature's guttural growl echoed through the stone hall behind them. "Do you think we can kill it?" Jonathan asked, more to himself than to Agatha. She straightened, eyes blazing with determination despite the pain etched into her features. "Not unless we find out what it is and how to stop it. And fast." Before Jonathan could answer, the creature lunged through the archway, its body contorting unnaturally as it landed. Its mouth opened wide, a sound of guttural, bone-chilling laughter escaping it as it crawled forward, the sharp, brittle sound of its bones creaking with each movement. Agatha met its charge head-on, stake in hand, her eyes locked with Jonathan's as she shouted, "Get out of here, Jonathan. Find Mina." "No," he roared back, gripping the sword tighter, feeling its weight balance in his hands. "I won't leave you." The creature came down upon her, its claws aiming for her throat, but Agatha spun, driving the stake forward. It met its mark with a sickening, wet thud. The creature screeched, a sound so inhuman it rattled Jonathan's teeth, and as it fell, it dissolved into a mass of black, writhing tendrils that splattered against the stone walls, leaving behind a stain that seemed to pulse like a living thing. Agatha collapsed, gasping for breath, the color drained from her face. "Go, Jonathan," she whispered, voice shaking as she reached out to him with a hand that trembled. "Find her." He hesitated, torn between the urgency to save her and the knowledge that Mina's life hung in the balance. The memory of her eyes flashed before him, and with a single, pained nod, he turned, sprinting down the narrow passage and into the cold, unforgiving depths of the castle once more. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the cries of the damned. Inside, Jonathan's heart pounded in time with his steps as he pushed forward, each moment slipping into the next like the passage of time through an hourglass. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps as he plunged deeper into the castle, ignoring the sharp pain in his side from an unseen cut. His mind whirled with a single, unyielding thought: find Mina. The echoes of the creature's last screech still vibrated through the stone walls, a reminder of the horrors that had been unleashed upon them. He stumbled, his hand brushing over the wall for support, feeling the rough, cold stone beneath his palm. The scent of damp and decay mixed with the iron tang of blood that clung to the air. He found himself at a massive double door, its intricate carvings depicting scenes of battles and banquets that had never been. The symbols glistened as if coated in sweat, shuddering under the weight of something more profound than just ancient craftsmanship. Pushing it open, he entered a grand hall that seemed to stretch on forever, a space where shadows twisted and flickered as if alive. And there she stood, Mina, her face framed by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the high, arched windows. But this was not the Mina he remembered. Her eyes were dull, empty sockets reflecting nothing but the void. Her lips moved, but no sound reached him, only the sickening, dry rasp of something scraping against stone. Mina! He shouted, his voice cracking. He sprinted forward, only to freeze when a deep, resonant voice echoed through the hall. Jonathan! The Count stepped forward from the shadows, his face impossibly youthful, eyes dark as the abyss itself. His presence exuded a chilling calm, his gaze fixed on Jonathan, who stood rooted to the spot, horror anchoring him. It's time to end this, Dracula whispered, his voice both mournful and triumphant. Time to claim what is mine. Jonathan clenched the sword tighter, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. He had to fight, for Mina, for the remnants of his own sanity. The room seemed to shift around him, the walls pulsating, closing in with each heartbeat. The air grew thick, each breath a struggle against suffocation. Dracula stepped forward, and with an inhuman speed, launched himself at Jonathan, a blur of black and crimson. Jonathan swung the sword with all the strength he could muster, the blade slicing through the darkness and catching Dracula across the chest. A roar like thunder shattered the silence as Dracula stumbled back, his form flickering as if caught between worlds. His eyes met Jonathan's for a moment, a flicker of recognition in them, of power, of rage, but something else, too, something like fear. Mina screamed, a sound that echoed off the cold stone and struck Jonathan's heart like a dagger. She fell to her knees, clutching at her chest as if trying to hold the shattered pieces together. Jonathan's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, the storm of desperation and despair in him stilled. Jonathan, please. Mina's voice was weak, yet filled with a haunting clarity. Save yourself. He couldn't. He wouldn't. With a newfound resolve, Jonathan lunged forward again, this time aiming for the Count's heart. Dracula's gaze met his once more, and for the first time, there was a fleeting moment of hesitation. But the moment passed, and the creature's form shifted, becoming more monstrous, eyes glistening with malice as he swept the sword aside and drove Jonathan to the ground. The pain was searing, a blaze that wrapped around his ribs, crackling like fire. Jonathan gasped, his vision dimming, and the shadows around him seemed to whisper, to claw at his soul. But he reached out, fingers closing around a stake that had fallen from Agatha's hand earlier in the fight. With a desperate surge, he plunged it into Dracula's heart. The Count let out a sound, half scream, half wail, that split the air. His body convulsed, twisting and turning as a dark, smoke-like essence leaked from his mouth, flooding the room with an unnatural, suffocating miasma. Dracula's body contorted one last time before dissolving into ash, falling in a slow cascade to the floor, leaving behind only the echoes of his tortured death. The room stilled, the pulse of the castle slowing, almost as if it, too, were breathing its last. Jonathan pushed himself up on trembling arms, his vision blurred. Mina, barely conscious, was sprawled on the cold stone. He reached for her, his fingers brushing against her skin, feeling the warmth return to her touch as the spell of the Count's influence broke. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with exhaustion and confusion. "Jonathan," she whispered, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "We're free." He couldn't answer, his chest still tight with the memory of what had just occurred. There was so much to say, so much to process, but for now, silence and the faint sound of the castle crumbling around them was all that mattered. The darkness outside, a mirror to the horror that had just unfolded, seemed to draw back, the clouds parting to reveal the pale light of dawn. They had survived, at least for now. But as Jonathan glanced at the shattered remnants of the great hall, a shiver of doubt passed over him. This was not the end. It couldn't be. And deep in the deepest shadow of his mind, something whispered that the nightmare was far from over.
The shadows of our last story fade, but the unease lingers in the air. Now, we shift to a chilling account of the unknown, a tale of alien abduction based on unsettling claims from real events. Prepare yourself as we delve into the unexplainable. The night they took me. It started with a hum, low, mechanical, like an engine far in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me, trying to will myself to sleep. It was just after midnight, and the small farmhouse I'd rented for the summer was silent except for the occasional chirp of crickets outside. The hum grew louder, though, and soon I could feel it. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration in my chest, in my bones, like standing too close to a massive speaker. My hands trembled as I threw off the covers and sat up. When I glanced out the window, everything looked wrong. The moon hung unnaturally low, casting an eerie silver light over the cornfields. The wind had stopped and the crickets had gone silent. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating, unnatural. And then I saw it, a light, impossibly bright, hovering above the tree line. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like it was breathing. I told myself it was a plane, or a drone, or some kind of equipment from the neighboring farms, but deep down, I knew better. Something about it was off. I don't remember deciding to go outside. One moment I was by the window, the next I was standing barefoot on the grass, staring up at the light. It was closer now, and I could see its shape, an enormous disc-like object, matte black except for the glowing ring of lights along its edge. It hovered soundlessly, defying gravity, and every hair on my body stood on end. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights. But I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my arms limp at my sides. And then the beam hit me. It wasn't like light. It was tangible, like being submerged in water. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. My entire body was weightless, suspended in the column of light as it lifted me off the ground. The world below me blurred into a swirl of green and black, and the last thing I remember was the cold, sterile smell of ozone before everything went dark. When I woke up, I was on a table. The room was stark, blindingly white, with no visible walls or ceiling, just an endless expanse of light. I couldn't tell where the glow was coming from. It seemed to radiate from everywhere at once. I wasn't alone. They stood around me, their bodies impossibly thin, their skin a dull gray that seemed to absorb the light. Their heads were oversized, with no hair, no ears, just smooth domes that glistened faintly. But it was their eyes that froze me, their enormous pitch-black eyes, like two voids that threatened to swallow me whole. They didn't speak, not with words anyway, but I could feel them in my mind, like whispers skittering across the surface of my thoughts. They were curious, analytical, as though I were some strange specimen they'd stumbled upon. I couldn't move. Straps held my arms and legs in place, though they didn't seem necessary. My body felt heavy, unresponsive, as though the beam had drained me of all strength. One of them stepped closer, its long, spindly fingers tracing a line down my forearm. The touch was ice cold, and I felt a sharp, burning pain as something punctured my skin. I craned my neck to see a thin, metallic instrument withdrawing a sliver of flesh. My screams were silent, swallowed by the endless whiteness. They worked with mechanical precision, poking, prodding, extracting samples from my body as though I were nothing more than an animal on a laboratory table. At one point, a needle as long as my forearm was lowered toward my eye, and I thought for sure I would die. But I didn't. As suddenly as it had started, it was over. I woke up in the cornfield, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the stalks, and the hum was gone. At first, I thought it had been a nightmare, a vivid, horrifying dream brought on by stress or exhaustion. But then I saw the marks. Small, circular burns dotted my forearm where the instrument had pierced my skin. A strange, geometric scar had appeared on my abdomen, faint but unmistakable. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was all in my head. But the memories wouldn't fade. The coldness of their touch, the black void of their eyes, the feeling of being utterly helpless, it haunted me. I kept to myself after that, avoiding the townsfolk and their polite but prying questions. The few times I ventured into town, I noticed something strange. People stared at me, not out of suspicion or malice, but as though they sensed something different, something wrong. It's been years now, but I still don't sleep well. The hum returns sometimes, faint but unmistakable, and I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the beam to come again. I know they're not done with me. They never are.
The first signs of trouble were subtle. The absence of any other cars on what was supposed to be a busy highway, the unusual stillness of the surrounding forest, and the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the pavement itself. Alex adjusted his rearview mirror, hoping to catch the distant glow of headlights behind him, but the road remained shrouded in darkness. The hum grew louder as he continued, a low, vibrating drone that seemed to burrow into his skull. It wasn't the engine. He turned the car radio off and rolled down the window to confirm it. The sound wasn't mechanical. It felt alive, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Ahead, the road split into two lanes. The right-hand path continued through the forest, the trees arching over like an ominous canopy. The left veered into an open plain, stretching out toward distant, jagged hills. Neither route looked familiar, though Alex had driven this way dozens of times before. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as indecision gripped him. There were no signs, no markers to guide him. Even his memory of the area betrayed him now. He couldn't recall these hills or this particular stretch of trees. The hum spiked suddenly, a sharp frequency that sent his stomach twisting. He winced, gripping his head with one hand as the car veered slightly. When he regained control, the two paths had somehow blended into one, their distinctions erased as the road reformed ahead. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The asphalt began to shimmer, as if covered in a thin layer of water. Alex slowed the car to a crawl, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. The surface seemed to ripple, distorting his reflection in the headlights. He stopped the car entirely, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror again, the road behind him was gone. Not just obscured by darkness, gone, replaced by an endless black void. Panic clawed at his chest as he fumbled with the door handle. He stumbled out of the car and onto the road, his shoes sinking slightly into the unnaturally soft pavement. The hum now filled the air around him, vibrating through his bones. Alex looked ahead. The road extended infinitely, its shimmering surface curving upward in the distance, defying logic and physics. He hesitated, but standing still felt more dangerous than moving forward. He climbed back into the car, every nerve in his body screaming at him to wake up, to snap out of whatever dream or nightmare this was. With a deep breath, he pressed the accelerator, and the car rolled forward, its tires hissing against the pliable road. The hum grew louder, almost melodic now, and he realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a voice, no, multiple voices, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. Ahead, the horizon began to shift. The hills warped and stretched, their jagged edges twisting into impossible shapes. The air thickened, making it harder to breathe, as if the atmosphere itself was rejecting him. Alex tightened his grip on the wheel. He could feel the road beneath him starting to change. It wasn't just soft anymore. It was moving, undulating like waves on the ocean. Then he saw them, shapes emerging from the shimmering surface, humanoid but grotesque, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They rose like apparitions, their features obscured by the wavering air. One stepped directly into the path of the car. Alex slammed on the brakes, but the creature didn't flinch. It stood motionless, its head tilted as though studying him. And then it smiled. The smile was wrong. Too wide, too many teeth, the corners of its mouth curling upward in a grotesque parody of human expression. Alex's chest tightened, a primal fear seizing him as the creature tilted its head further, its neck bending at an impossible angle. The car trembled beneath him, the road undulating like a living thing. He shifted into reverse, intending to back away, but the rearview mirror reflected nothing. The void loomed behind him, infinite and impenetrable. The creature moved, not a step but a flicker, a disjointed shift forward, as though reality had skipped a frame. Its smile remained fixed, its eyeless gaze locked onto Alex. He hit the gas. The tires screeched, but the car lurched forward only a few feet before something stopped it cold. A shudder ran through the frame, and Alex's head snapped forward, smacking the steering wheel. Blood trickled down his nose as he looked up, dazed. The creature was standing on the hood, its limbs extended, bending in unnatural ways as it leaned toward the windshield. The glass cracked under the pressure of its weight, spiderweb fractures spreading outward. "Go away!" Alex screamed, slamming his fists against the dashboard. The creature's mouth opened wider, its teeth stretching impossibly long, jagged and glistening. The chanting voices in the air grew louder, synchronizing with the hum that had now reached an unbearable pitch. Alex grabbed the door handle and shoved it open, tumbling out onto the rippling road. The ground was warm, almost sticky, and it seemed to pull at him as he scrambled to his feet. He turned to run, but the road stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no car behind him now, no void, just more of the shimmering, undulating asphalt. The creature's laughter, if it could be called that, echoed in the air, a distorted, grating sound that made Alex's skin crawl. He looked back to see it crawling off the hood of his car, its limbs moving like a spider's, each motion jerky and unnatural. Without thinking, he bolted. The chanting grew louder, the words now sharp and guttural. The air itself seemed to press against him, resisting his every step. The road beneath his feet rippled violently, throwing him off balance. Ahead, figures began to rise from the asphalt. Dozens of them, no, hundreds, each one grotesque and malformed, their eyeless faces turned toward him. "Stop," one of them said. The voice was layered, overlapping tones that seemed to vibrate through his skull. Alex didn't stop. He couldn't. He pushed forward, weaving between the figures, their hands grasping at him with elongated fingers. Some of them melted back into the road as he passed, while others turned to watch him with that same wide, unnatural smile. The road ahead twisted, spiraling upward like a corkscrew. Gravity seemed to shift, pulling him toward the incline. He stumbled, clawing at the asphalt to keep his footing as the world bent around him. At the top of the spiral, a doorway loomed. It was massive and ancient-looking, carved from black stone and pulsating with the same eerie hum that filled the air. Alex hesitated, but the figures were closing in. Their distorted forms moved faster now, their smiles stretching wider. With no other choice, he threw himself through the doorway. The hum stopped. Silence enveloped him as he tumbled into darkness. For a moment, he thought he had fallen into the void, but then his feet found solid ground. The world around him flickered to life, dim and hazy. He was standing in a vast, empty plain, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky above was a sickly yellow, devoid of stars or clouds. He turned to look back at the doorway, but it was gone. Instead, he saw a figure. It was standing in the distance, far too still, far too quiet. It didn't move, but Alex knew it was watching him. The chanting began again, faint and distant, as the figure took its first step forward. Alex felt the dry, brittle ground shift beneath his feet as he tried to step back. The figure in the distance wasn't just approaching, it was growing. With every step, its form stretched unnaturally, as if the landscape itself were warping to accommodate it. The chanting grew louder, coming from no discernible direction, vibrating in his chest and skull. Alex clutched at his temples, trying to block out the sound, but it only seemed to grow sharper, more invasive. The figure stopped. It was closer now, impossibly tall, its body an amalgamation of shifting, liquid-like shadows. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth, featureless void that seemed to drink in the sickly light around it. "Why?" Alex whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the chant. The figure tilted what might have been its head. The chanting stopped, plunging the world into a deafening silence. Then, a voice, a low, guttural sound that resonated through the air. "Why do you run?" Alex's knees buckled, the sheer weight of the voice pressing down on him. It wasn't a question. It was a command, pulling at the very fabric of his mind, demanding an answer he didn't have. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened, words dying before they could form. The figure began to move again, this time not walking but gliding across the ground, leaving a trail of darkness in its wake. Desperate, Alex turned and ran. The ground seemed to resist him, his feet sinking slightly with every step. He could feel the figure behind him, its presence heavy and suffocating, like a storm cloud ready to break. Ahead, the landscape shifted. What had been a barren plain now sprouted twisted, jagged structures, monoliths of black stone, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly. They rose like teeth from the earth, forming a labyrinth that seemed to rearrange itself as he moved. He darted between the monoliths, the symbols glowing brighter as he passed. The chanting returned, more urgent, more chaotic, the words blending into an incomprehensible cacophony. The air grew colder, each breath stabbing at his lungs like icy needles. The figure's voice returned, louder now, echoing through the labyrinth. "There is no escape." Alex stumbled, his shoulder slamming into one of the monoliths. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The labyrinth began to close in, the monoliths shifting closer together, their jagged edges scraping against one another. Alex squeezed through a narrowing gap, the rough stone tearing at his clothes and skin. Finally, he emerged into an open space, a circular clearing surrounded by the towering monoliths. In the center stood a pedestal, its surface glowing with a soft, blue light. On it rested a single object, a key, ancient and ornate, its design both intricate and incomprehensible. Alex hesitated, the chanting rising to a fever pitch. The figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, its form now larger than ever, its void-like face fixed on him. "Take it," the voice boomed, though whether it came from the figure or the chanting itself, Alex couldn't tell. His hand trembled as he reached for the key. The air around it felt alive, buzzing with an energy that made his skin crawl. The moment his fingers touched the key, the world around him shattered. The chanting stopped. The figure vanished. Alex found himself back in his car, parked on the side of a desolate road. The GPS screen blinked faintly, its distorted map slowly returning to normal. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the key now clutched tightly in his other hand. A voice crackled through the car's speakers, faint but unmistakable. "You chose poorly." The engine roared to life on its own, and the car began to move. Not forward, not backward, but into something else entirely. A darkness that swallowed the world whole. The key in his hand grew colder, heavier, as the chanting returned, louder than ever. The car jerked forward, its tires screeching against the road as if the very surface was alive, unwilling to let him pass. Alex slammed his foot on the brake, but the pedal felt as though it had no power. The car continued to lurch forward, dragged by an invisible force. Through the windshield, the landscape had changed. The desolate stretch of road, the barren horizon, had disappeared. Instead, all that Alex could see was an expanse of endless, gray mist. The sky above had turned an oppressive shade of purple, and the trees, what remained of them, twisted like broken fingers reaching up to a sky that seemed to consume everything. His breathing became shallow, heart hammering in his chest. The key in his hand seemed to pulse, its cold surface growing colder, slick with an unknown substance that stained his palm. He tried to throw it, to rid himself of it, but his hand wouldn't let go. It was as though the key had become part of him, rooted deep inside his skin. "You should not have taken it," the voice boomed once more. It was no longer crackling through the speakers, but coming from within the car, surrounding him like a heavy fog. Alex's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, looming behind him. But the mirror reflected nothing but darkness. He glanced back to the road ahead, and that's when he saw it. A figure, or what should have been a figure, emerging from the fog. It was impossible to focus on. Every time Alex tried to look at it directly, his vision would blur. But he could feel it watching him. It wasn't a presence. It was an invader, an anomaly that shouldn't exist in this world. Its form moved, not by walking, but by rippling through the air as if it were pulling the very fabric of reality with it. With a sudden, sharp jolt, the car surged forward, its headlights flickering wildly as if the vehicle itself were struggling to maintain its form. The fog thickened, and the mist poured in through every crack and seam of the car. Alex could feel it, not just physically but in his thoughts. It was invasive, corrupting his very consciousness, pulling his mind apart, making him forget himself, making him become a part of it. Suddenly, the car stopped. The sound of the engine died, leaving only the eerie silence that seemed to smother everything. Alex gripped the steering wheel harder, feeling the sweat begin to bead on his forehead. He looked at the key again, and it was as if the markings had shifted, as if the strange symbols had come to life under his gaze. Then, the voice returned. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it felt louder than any shout. "There is no road left for you, Alex. You've come too far." He slammed his fist against the dashboard, but no sound came from the car. His body felt detached, as if it weren't his anymore. The more he tried to control his movements, the more they slipped away from him. He turned to look out the window. The road, if it was even a road, had been replaced by what could only be described as nothingness, a vast expanse of black and gray that seemed to stretch forever. The key had warmed in his hand, warmed in an unnatural way. It felt like it was alive, like it was no longer just an object, but a part of the void, of whatever force had drawn him into this place. A figure, a true one this time, emerged from the fog beside the car. Not an abstract, shifting presence, but a woman. Her face was pale, eyes hollow and dark, and her mouth curved into a sadistic smile. She stepped closer to the window, her hand pressing against the glass. Alex tried to move, to scream, but he was paralyzed, unable to do anything but stare into her eyes. "You know what must be done," she murmured, her voice a sound that seemed to echo not just in the car but inside his skull, making his teeth ache. The key vibrated violently in his hand, the symbols now flashing, twisting in a desperate attempt to form coherent shapes, but the patterns made no sense. The voice grew louder. "No escape, Alex. You've taken what you shouldn't have. Now you must stay. You're already one of us." Alex tried to shout, to tear at the air in frustration, but as he opened his mouth, he felt something foreign slip inside him. It was a cold, slithering sensation that crawled under his skin, filling his body with a numbness that went deeper than his bones. His pulse slowed, his heart sinking. The woman smiled again, her face turning into something unrecognizable. The soft lines became sharp, grotesque, her mouth stretching impossibly wide as she spoke again. "This is your road now. This is your eternity." Alex's last thought was a question, a desperate, futile cry for some kind of sense. Why? Why me? But there was no answer, only silence. The car was gone, the fog engulfing him, the key warm in his palm, and the road, if it could still be called a road, disappearing beneath him. His mind unraveled as the world blurred, no longer existing in any form he could understand. And then, the road, the fog, the woman, the car, they were gone. The silence that followed was oppressive, a thick, suffocating air that seemed to weigh down on Alex's chest, making it difficult to breathe. It was as if the world around him had vanished, leaving him alone in a void, suspended in time and space. But as his senses slowly began to return, a soft sound reached his ears, a distant, rhythmic thumping. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, as though something was drawing near. Alex's head snapped to the side, his eyes searching for the source of the noise, but the void around him was still too thick, too impenetrable to see anything clearly. He felt a strange pull, as if the very air was guiding him toward the sound. He hesitated. The instinct to flee was strong, but he felt a bizarre compulsion to move forward, to seek the source of the noise. His legs, unbidden, began to carry him, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ground beneath him was uneven, soft and shifting, as though it weren't solid at all but rather a strange, formless substance. The thumping grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural hum, like a whispering wind, only it wasn't wind. It was something else, something that made his skin crawl. Then, ahead of him, the fog parted slightly, revealing a shadow in the distance. It was large, too large to be a person, but its outline was blurred, indistinct. The shape seemed to shift in and out of focus, as though it was constantly in flux, not quite solid. Alex felt his heart race. The overwhelming urge to turn back surged within him, but his legs wouldn't obey. The strange hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, and the shadowy figure seemed to move, slowly at first, then faster, as though it was aware of his presence, and now it was coming for him. He stumbled backward, his breath shallow, but no matter how much he tried to move, his feet were rooted to the ground, as though the earth itself had claimed him. The figure was closer now, its shape becoming clearer. It wasn't human. The more Alex tried to comprehend what he was seeing, the more it eluded him. His body rippled like water, shifting in and out of reality. Long, jagged limbs stretched toward him, fingers that looked more like elongated claws than anything human. The face, if it could even be called a face, was a mass of shifting shadows, a patchwork of distorted features that seemed to blur and meld into one another. It was alive in a way that defied all logic, and the closer it came, the more Alex could feel his own mind unraveling. The sound of its movement, the rhythmic thumping, was no longer just a noise. It was a force, a presence, pressing against him from all sides, filling his thoughts, pushing into the cracks of his sanity. "Help! Me!" Alex gasped, but the words felt foreign in his mouth. His tongue felt thick, sluggish, as though it was no longer his own. He reached out, his hand trembling, desperate to make contact with something, anything. But the moment his fingers brushed against the air, they passed through it like it was smoke. The figure stopped in front of him. The air around it crackled, a low hum vibrating through the ground. Alex felt the presence of something ancient and powerful, a being that had existed long before him and would endure long after. It was impossible to tell whether it was alive or not, or whether it even cared about him. Then it spoke. His voice wasn't words, not exactly. It was a sensation, a feeling that scraped against his very essence, burrowing deep inside his mind. It was both too loud and too quiet at the same time, and Alex could barely comprehend it. It was a message, but one that made no sense. Endings are inevitable, it said, though the sound wasn't truly a sound. It was a thought, a jarring intrusion into his mind. Beginnings are a lie. The words hung in the air, the space around him growing colder, darker. The figure moved closer, its arms outstretched, and Alex tried to scream, but the sound never left his throat. It was as if his body was no longer his thoughts no longer his, and every part of him was being absorbed, consumed by the entity before him. Suddenly, the sensation stopped. The world held still for a moment, and in that brief instant, Alex felt something that could only be described as peace. the absence of fear, the absence of time. But it was fleeting. The peace shattered as quickly as it had come, replaced by a torrent of confusion, dread, and pain. The figure's face twisted in a way that wasn't quite human, and its voice rang out again, louder this time, filling his skull, reverberating inside his chest. Your road has no end, Alex. You are already lost. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest, and for a moment, everything went black. Alex's vision flickered as he regained consciousness. His body felt heavy, like he was sinking into the ground, unable to escape. He tried to move, but his limbs felt as if they had been shackled by an invisible force. The darkness was overwhelming, but not quite complete. There was something about the air, a faint shimmer, like the world around him was alive and watching. The pain in his chest was still there, gnawing at him, a constant reminder that he was not free. He could feel the weight of something pressing against him, but there was no sight of the figure anymore. It was as though it had dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the lingering sensation of its presence. His breathing was shallow, each inhalation harder than the last. Panic began to claw at him, the fear of being trapped, of never escaping, tightening around his chest. His thoughts spun in circles, a disjointed mix of memories and disorienting confusion. What was happening? Was he still dreaming? Was this the end? He tried to focus, to make sense of his surroundings, but there was nothing, just the endless, suffocating blackness. His eyes darted around, seeking anything that could give him a clue, a sense of direction, but all he saw was the void. It felt as though time had stopped, and the world itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a noise pierced the silence, a soft, whispering sound, barely audible, but it was there. It was as if something was moving in the distance, skittering across the ground. The noise was erratic, like the patter of small feet, but it was too irregular, too disjointed to be anything natural. Alex's heart raced as he strained to listen, his ears desperate for some indication of what was happening. The skittering grew louder, closer, and the air around him seemed to ripple with the sound. It was impossible to place, to make sense of, and yet it felt unmistakably wrong. He wanted to call out, but his voice failed him. His throat felt dry, constricted. His body was paralyzed, trapped in this inescapable nightmare. The sensation of being watched was growing stronger. It was like something, or someone, was just out of his reach, circling him, waiting for the right moment. Then the skittering stopped. There was only silence again, an oppressive stillness that made his heart pound in his ears. And then, with terrifying slowness, something new began to emerge from the blackness. It was a presence, something that shifted in and out of perception, like a dark cloud gathering in the distance. The very air around him seemed to thicken, pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. He heard breathing slow, ragged, like the exhale of a dying animal. It was coming from all around him, not from one direction, but from everywhere. His pulse quickened, and his body screamed to move, to run, but he couldn't. He was frozen, his limbs unresponsive. The breathing grew louder, more labored, and the darkness around him seemed to contract, closing in with suffocating speed. He could feel the temperature drop, a cold that seeped deep into his bones, an unnatural chill that didn't belong in the air. His skin prickled, as if the very touch of the cold was making his flesh crawl. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, a voice. It wasn't the figure's voice, but something else, something more distant, more ancient, and it whispered in a language Alex couldn't understand. The words felt like they were vibrating inside his skull, like something foreign was clawing at the edges of his mind. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, though they were still incomprehensible. And as they did, Alex felt a sudden pressure, a feeling of being pulled in all directions, as if the fabric of reality itself was tearing apart. Something was coming. Something was watching him, waiting for him to lose his mind. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, the edges of his perception fraying. The darkness was closing in, and with it came the suffocating feeling of being consumed, of being drawn into something far older, far more powerful than anything he could comprehend. The last thought that crossed his mind before the world seemed to swallow him whole was a simple, horrifying realization. This was never going to end. The road that cut through the Sierra Madre Oriental, known to the locals as La Carretera del Diablo, the Devil's Highway, stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a palpable mystery hanging in the air. No one who had ever traveled it returned without stories of strange happenings. But like so many things in Mexico, these accounts dissolved into nervous laughter and evasive glances. No one dared speak the full truth. No one talked about what really happened in that remote part of the country. Javier had never been one to believe in superstitions or ghost stories or spirits. He grew up hearing tales from his grandfather about the dark nights in the mountains, rumors of strange lights floating above the road, and cars that would vanish without a trace. But at the end of the day, Javier knew those were just stories meant to scare children. So, when he received the offer for a job that required a drive through that very area, he didn't think twice. It would be a long drive, sure, but nothing he couldn't handle. After all, he was a man of science, of logic. He didn't believe in such things. The weather was overcast, and a thick fog covered the landscape as Javier ventured deeper into the winding dirt road that connected the main highway to the rural communities inland. The only sound was the hum of his car's engine, cutting through the oppressive silence of the mountains. Occasionally, shadows moving between the trees gave him the unsettling feeling that something was watching him, but he quickly dismissed it as mere paranoia. The landscape began to change rapidly. What had once been dense, green vegetation turned into a barren, rocky terrain. Javier didn't know it yet, but he was entering a cursed territory, one from which few ever returned. In the distance, a shadowy figure appeared on the road, so suddenly that he had no time to brake. It was a man, or at least it seemed to be at first glance. He stood motionless in the middle of the road, a silhouette barely distinguishable from the mist. His figure was hunched, and he wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, hiding his features. Javier slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just a few feet away from the stranger. The man didn't move. No wave of the hand, no acknowledgement of the car that had nearly hit him. Javier stared at him for a moment, his heart racing. A cold chill crept over him despite the warmth of the car. He was alone in this desolate place, with nothing but the distant mountains and a thick fog that seemed to close in around him. "Hey!" Javier called out, lowering the window. His voice was shaky, the words forced past the tightness in his throat. "Are you okay?" The man remained motionless, as if he hadn't heard him. Javier's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Was the man lost? Injured? But no, he was standing too perfectly still to be anything but strange. Something was wrong. Javier felt a sudden impulse to drive past him, to get away from the unnerving figure, but as his foot hovered over the accelerator, a low, eerie sound broke the silence, the unmistakable hum of an engine. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the noise grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Another car, but where had it come from? There hadn't been another vehicle on the road since he'd left the nearest town hours ago. Javier's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The faint glow of headlights pierced the fog behind him, moving quickly toward him. Yet, when he looked back at the figure, the man was gone, vanished. Confused, Javier's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He looked out of the windshield and noticed something even more unsettling. The fog had grown thicker, almost impenetrable, and the headlights of the approaching car were now directly behind him. But there was no sign of the vehicle itself. Felt as though it was there, but not. The humming sound grew louder, like something was flying just above his car, circling. He could feel it now, a presence in the air, a cold, unnatural presence that seemed to press against his skin. Javier's breath quickened. He was no longer sure what was real. Suddenly, his car jerked, and he felt a sharp pull to the left. The wheel turned on its own, as if someone was steering it. Panic surged through him. He tried to regain control, but the steering wheel was unresponsive, as if a force outside of himself was guiding the car off the road, toward the edge of the cliff. The headlights in the rearview mirror flickered, and for a brief moment, they illuminated something strange. Dark figures, floating just above the ground, like shadows without substance. They didn't walk, they hovered. Javier's breath caught in his throat, and a scream built in his chest, but it was swallowed by the deep, suffocating silence that had overtaken the car. The car lurched again, and this time it was too much. The tires screamed as they hit the loose gravel, and the world spun around him. He was no longer on the road. He was falling into the abyss. With a sudden jolt, the car stopped. The force of the impact threw Javier forward, his face slamming against the steering wheel. For a moment, everything was black. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the car. He was standing on a desolate stretch of highway, the air heavy with the stench of decay and something far older, something inhuman. The fog had receded, but the sky was dark, too dark, as though the sun had never existed in this place. A distant, guttural sound reached his ears, a low, growling hum that vibrated in his chest. He turned around, his legs unsteady, and saw it. The road stretched endlessly, but there was no sign of his car, nor the strange figures. Just the desolate, empty highway stretching into oblivion. His mind raced, but his body refused to move. In the distance, there was a flicker, like the briefest of sparks, before the hum returned, louder, more insistent. The darkness shifted, and a shape loomed in the fog. A shape that wasn't quite human, nor entirely animal. It stood there, its elongated form casting a shadow against the fog, waiting. Javier's heart pounded in his chest, but his body refused to flee. He felt rooted to the spot, as though the very ground beneath him was part of the malevolent force that surrounded him. And then the whispers began. They were soft at first, voices in a language he couldn't understand, calling to him, pulling at him, begging him to listen. But as they grew louder, he could feel them in his skull, gnawing at his mind. The figures, the things in the fog, moved closer, circling him. He could hear their voices now, clearer. They weren't speaking to him. They were speaking through him. Javier's chest tightened as the voices poured into his mind, relentless and incomprehensible. They came from all directions, whispers that coiled around his thoughts, making it impossible to distinguish his own fear from their collective madness. His body was frozen, gripped by an invisible force that made even the slightest movement impossible. The creature in the distance, that shape in the fog, took a step forward. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs elongated and grotesque, twisting in ways that defied logic. Its head was massive, misshapen, with too many eyes, too many teeth, and a mouth that seemed to stretch wider than any human could possibly manage. As it moved, the air grew colder, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the very core of his being. Javier wanted to scream, to run, but his voice was choked by the weight of the air around him, and his legs felt like lead. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to move, but it was as if something unseen was holding him in place. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat like the rhythm of some dreadful drum, growing faster, faster, and faster until he thought his heart might explode. The creature, if it could even be called that, came closer. Its steps made no sound against the asphalt, and yet it seemed to consume all the noise around it, as though its presence sucked the world dry of sound. With each step, the fog seemed to grow denser, suffocating, swallowing the road, the sky, and even the faint light that dared to hang in the air. Javier's breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. Then the whispers changed. They were no longer unintelligible murmurs. They began to form words that Javier understood, but that made no sense. "You shouldn't have come. It's too late. They're already watching." The words cut through his mind like a blade. Javier tried to shake them off, tried to block them out, but it was as if his own thoughts were no longer his own. They were being replaced by something darker, something older than the earth itself. A chill swept through his spine as he saw it. In the fog, behind the creature, more shapes were moving, hundreds of them. Not figures, not people, but things. Shadowy, translucent forms that shifted and slithered, each one distinct, yet all connected. They were watching him. They were waiting. He felt a sudden compulsion to move, to look away, but his body refused to obey. His hands were trembling now, though he couldn't remember when they had started. He tried to turn his head, to look anywhere but at the thing in front of him, but something kept his gaze locked in place. It was as if the creature's eyes were not just looking at him but through him, pulling the very essence of his being into some unseen dimension. "Help us," the creature whispered, its voice now deep and guttural, the words reverberating in his chest. "You've already taken the first step. You're already part of it now." Javier's mind swam with confusion. Part of it? What did that mean? What did they want? He felt a sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath him was shifting. The world seemed to tilt and warp, reality itself bending under some unseen weight. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth, and from within came a sound unlike anything Javier had ever heard. It was the sound of thousands of voices speaking at once, overlapping, calling his name, tearing through his mind, each syllable scraping at the edges of his sanity. "Join us," it hissed, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows behind it swirled, pulsing like a living thing, each movement deliberate and slow, as though savoring his terror. Javier's stomach twisted into knots, his body screaming in agony as he fought against the invisible bonds that held him in place. The voices echoed in his mind, louder now, too loud, an endless cacophony of desperation and hunger. His vision blurred, the world around him flickering, like a broken film reel struggling to maintain coherence. "You are ours," the creature growled, its breath hot against Javier's skin despite the freezing cold of the air. "You've crossed the threshold. You've entered the realm beyond the living." Javier's world fractured. The road, the fog, the mountains. All of it seemed to dissolve, leaving him standing on a precipice between two worlds, one of life and one of an eternity he could never escape. The edges of his vision warped, bending into a dizzying spiral as the presence of the creatures overwhelmed him, suffocating him with their unseen touch. Suddenly, a crackling noise filled the air, a harsh, static sound that cut through the whispers. Javier's heart skipped a beat. His mind, barely holding on to reality, grasped for something familiar, something that made sense. The static intensified, and then, in a blinding flash of light, everything went silent. The fog dissipated. The creatures were gone. Javier found himself back in the driver's seat of his car, his hands clutching the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. His breath came in sharp gasps, and his body was slick with sweat. The car was no longer on the mountain road. It was parked on the side of the highway, its engine off. The road was empty, still, quiet. His pulse raced, but he didn't dare move. His mind was a maze of confusion and horror. Had it all been a hallucination? Had he lost his mind? But as he looked out the window, the same oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the wind that whispered through the trees. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty stretch of road behind him. But instead, his reflection stared back at him, only it wasn't quite his own. The face in the mirror was gaunt, pale, and wide-eyed with terror. It was as if he had aged years in a single instant. And then, a slow smile crept across the reflection's face, a smile that wasn't his own. Javier blinked, and the face was gone. But the whispering, the voices, they had followed him. They always would. Javier's heart pounded violently, and his breath caught in his throat as he stared at the rearview mirror. His reflection was now completely normal. He rubbed his eyes, almost as if trying to convince himself that what he had just seen was an illusion. But the feeling remained. There was a presence, something watching him, lurking just beyond his comprehension. He turned the key in the ignition, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The car sputtered to life, the low hum of the engine filling the void of the night. But the silence felt wrong. It was too perfect, too suffocating, like the world had been hushed on purpose. A silence that wasn't natural. A silence that pressed against his eardrums, making it impossible to ignore. Javier forced himself to look away from the rearview mirror, focusing on the road ahead. But there, just at the edge of the dim headlights, a figure stood. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. His breath hitched as he stared into the dark outline of a person standing perfectly still on the side of the road. It was a man, his body tall, thin, and unnervingly rigid. His features were indistinct, blurred as though they couldn't quite stay in focus, shifting like smoke caught in a wind that didn't exist. "Help me!" The voice was faint, and it was not a voice that came from the man's mouth. It felt as if the sound itself was being birthed from the ground beneath him, from the very air. Javier's hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but then stopped. What was he doing? Why would he get out of the car? He wasn't supposed to interact with this, whatever this was. The man, if that was even a man, started walking toward him slowly, almost deliberately. Each step seemed too deliberate, too purposeful, as if every motion had been calculated. His body did not sway or shift with the natural grace of a human. It moved in rigid angles, as though its limbs were on the verge of snapping at any given moment. Javier's pulse raced. A part of him wanted to drive away, to escape, but another part of him, something deeper, something primal, was paralyzed by the grotesque, hypnotic movement of the figure. He watched, almost entranced, as the man continued his approach. "Help me!" The voice grew louder now, but it wasn't coming from the figure. No, it was coming from everywhere. The sound wrapped around him like a wave of icy water, crashing over his mind, drowning his thoughts. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his fingers went numb, but he couldn't look away. The man, or whatever it was now inches from the windshield. He could see his face clearly now, but it was not the face of a person. No, it was a face that seemed to be made from shifting things, like it couldn't decide what it was. The eyes, if you could call them eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to draw the light from the air itself. They stared at him with an unnatural intensity, as though they could see everything inside him, tearing through his memories and fears like an open wound. Suddenly, the air in the car grew heavy, thick, like trying to breathe underwater. The car's lights flickered, and for a brief second, the landscape around him warped. The road stretched and bent in impossible directions, curving and twisting in ways that defied geometry, like the very fabric of reality had unraveled. Javier's breath came in ragged gasps. He fumbled with the gearshift, his mind racing with every possible way to escape this nightmare. But no matter how fast he thought, how quickly he acted, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. His hand reaching for the gear, the figure still standing in front of him, not moving, not blinking, only watching. The voice inside the car was now screaming, no longer a whisper, but a shrill wail that seemed to fill every inch of space. "Help me!" Javier's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror once again. His reflection was gone. He blinked, and then, there it was, the creature from the fog, standing right behind him in the mirror, its hands pressing against the window, leaving marks like ink bleeding through the glass. "Help me!" The voice echoed once again, and this time it was not just in his ears. It was in his mind. It was his own voice, but not his own. The words came from the deepest, darkest part of him, a part that was screaming in horror, begging for release. The temperature in the car dropped even further. His breath came out in plumes of white mist, the windows fogging up. The smell of decay, of something ancient and rotten, began to seep into the air. He could feel the weight of it in his lungs, as though the very air itself was poisoned, tainted by something not human. Suddenly, the figure outside the car let out a loud crack, and his body bent at an unnatural angle, like a marionette with its strings cut. His limbs twisted and contorted, each movement accompanied by a sickening popping sound, as if the joints were being torn apart. Javier's body jerked in panic, his mind overwhelmed by the horror of the moment. The road, the car, the night. It all felt unreal now, like he was inside a nightmare that was bleeding into reality. He slammed his foot on the gas, his tires screeching in protest as the car lurched forward, tearing through the fog. But as the car sped down the road, the landscape around him didn't change. The fog, the shadows, the twisted trees, they all blurred, merging into a continuous, never-ending loop. The road stretched on and on. It didn't end. He was going in circles, trapped in some kind of impossible loop, like the road had no beginning and no end. There was no escape, no destination, just an endless stretch of dark, empty nothingness. And in the distance, he could see them, the figures, 100 of them standing perfectly still on the side of the road, just like the first one, all with their hollow eyes, their unnatural movements, their silent, eternal waiting. They're always watching. The voice echoed again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the car. It wasn't coming from the figures. It was coming from inside him. The road was never meant to be driven. He wasn't meant to be here. Javier's grip on the wheel loosened. His vision blurred. His heart stopped. And then the silence came again. Not a natural silence, but the kind of silence that presses down on you, that fills you up, that drowns you from within. Javier's eyes fluttered closed, and as the car kept moving, the figures multiplied. And somewhere, in the distance, something waited for him. As the car continued its endless journey through the void, the feeling of isolation deepened. Javier could no longer remember the direction he was traveling, nor could he recall the last turn he had made. Time had become irrelevant, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. The headlights of the car illuminated only a foggy, infinite blackness, and yet, he couldn't shake the sensation that the darkness was alive, breathing with him, suffocating him from all sides. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the silence, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The sound was so deep it vibrated in his bones, making the car's frame tremble like a leaf caught in a storm. Javier's pulse quickened as the sound grew louder, more resonant, and somehow more familiar. Felt like it was calling to him, urging him forward. Without thinking, his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming urge to follow the noise. It was as though the car was no longer his to control, the engine purring like an ancient beast, pulling him towards something unseen. In the rearview mirror, the fog seemed to shift once more. The figures were gone, but something else was taking their place. Shapes, twisted and shifting, began to emerge from the dense mist. Javier squinted, his heart thudding in his chest. They weren't human, at least not in any sense he could understand. These were creatures, their bodies long and contorted, with skin like raw leather stretched too tightly over their bones. Their eyes glowed faintly, pale like the moon, but there was no warmth in them, no humanity, just the unblinking stare of something that had seen too much, something that had lived far longer than any mortal should. One of them took a step forward, then another, and another. Javier's breath caught in his throat as he tried to accelerate, but the car seemed to be moving slower, as if the very road beneath him was trying to hold him in place, unwilling to let him escape. The figures were now advancing too, moving with an unnatural fluidity, as though their bodies were not bound by the constraints of natural law. His fingers trembled as he twisted the wheel, trying to speed up. But it was no use. The creatures were almost upon him now, their eyes fixed directly on him, staring through the windshield with a cold, knowing gaze that sent a chill down his spine. He could feel it then, creeping into his chest, a pressure like a weight on his heart. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something deeper, something older. It was as if something in the car, in the road, in the very air had been waiting for him all along. He had been drawn here for a reason, but what was it? Then, without warning, a flash of light broke through the fog, briefly illuminating the figures. For a split second, Javier saw them more clearly. Their limbs were twisted and asymmetrical, some even broken in places, as though their bodies had been distorted by something incomprehensible. Their faces were stretched into grotesque smiles, their mouths impossibly wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. Their skin was mottled with patches of darkness, pulsating as though something lived underneath. As the light flickered out, the road ahead seemed to change again. The blackness deepened. The fog thickened until it swallowed the car completely. Javier couldn't see anything anymore. The car's headlights were useless. The creatures, the road, everything had vanished. It was just him and the relentless hum in the air. Suddenly, a sharp bang sounded against the side of the car. Javier flinched, his body freezing. He glanced to his left, but there was nothing there. His breathing became shallow, panicked. He tried to look around, but the darkness was now so thick, it felt like the car was floating in a void, the world outside a mere dream that he could no longer reach. Bang. Another sound, louder this time from the right. Someone was there, behind the car. He could feel it, pressing against the thin layer of metal separating him from whatever waited outside. His breath hitched as he slowly turned to look out the side window. There, just beyond the glass, was a face. A twisted, mangled face, pressed up against the window, its eyes wide open and unblinking. The skin was rotted, its features contorted into an expression of sheer agony. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he had ever seen before. Javier screamed, slamming his foot down on the gas pedal. But the car did not move. The figure on the side of the window did not move. It was as if they were both trapped in the same suspended moment, caught in a loop of impossibility. The face outside stayed there, pressed against the glass, its distorted grin widening in an unnatural, mocking way. The hum grew louder. Bang. Another noise came from the back this time, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Nothing. His mind was unraveling now, his thoughts crumbling under the weight of the horror that pressed against him. The road stretched on endlessly, unchanging. The car moved in perfect silence. No sound but that horrific hum vibrating through the walls of the vehicle. Bang, bang, bang. The figure's face appeared once again, now on the window to his left. Javier slammed his hands against the wheel, feeling like he was losing his grip on everything, on reality itself. Was he awake? Was this happening? Could he even trust his own senses anymore? The face grinned wider, its mouth splitting open impossibly wide, its teeth sharp and jagged like some monstrous predator. It whispered his name, but the voice, oh, the voice, it was not human. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had existed long before human ears could even fathom language. Javier! He screamed again, this time desperately, violently, thrashing at the wheel, trying to break free from the suffocating grip of whatever was holding him here. But it was no use. The figure's face was now inside the car. Its black eyes locked onto his with an expression that said everything. You are ours. And then the car stopped. The headlights flickered once more before cutting out completely. The world went dark. The silence that followed was deafening. Javier's pulse pounded in his ears, his chest rising and falling erratically as he struggled to catch his breath. His fingers still gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, but the world outside had become entirely still. The hum that had filled the air, vibrating deep into his bones, had vanished as if it had never existed. He slowly turned his head, his body stiff with fear, dreading what he might see. The figure outside the car, the thing that had been pressing against the window, its twisted face so close he could almost smell its decaying flesh, was gone. In its place, the darkness stretched out before him, suffocating and empty. No figure, no fog, just an oppressive nothingness. But then, just as he began to think he might finally be free, it happened again. A soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound reached his ears, coming from somewhere near the back of the car. It was faint, like a branch brushing against the roof in the wind, but there was no wind, no trees, nothing. His blood ran cold as he held his breath, staring straight ahead. Scrape. The noise was unmistakable. Something was moving. Something was inside the car. He jerked his head back, eyes wide, searching the interior, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadows in the corners. just the sterile, empty space of the cabin. The chill that had once suffused the car was now a thick frost, and his breath condensed in the air in front of him, swirling in the dead stillness. Scrape. The noise came again, louder this time, and then a sudden, sickening pop, like a broken bone snapping under pressure. Javier's breath hitched, his heart hammering in his chest. He was suffocating. He couldn't breathe. His body felt paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare where nothing was as it seemed. He forced himself to move, to act, to open the door and flee, but his hands were shaking too violently. The door handle seemed miles away, taunting him, unreachable. He was locked in, a prisoner of his own terror. The scraping sound was closer now, impossibly close, as if something was crawling beneath the seat. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, but the reflection that stared back at him was distorted. The car's windows were dark, like portals into an abyss, and in the faint light from the dashboard, he saw shapes, something moving just beyond the glass. Not human, not any creature he could recognize. They were figures, elongated, twisted, and writhing. They slid across the snow, their unnatural shapes cutting through the fog like phantoms. He could hear their breath now, slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring the terror they were inflicting upon him. In the rear view, one of the figures stepped forward, tall and imposing, its face too blurred to make out. Its silhouette seemed to bend, to distort, as if reality itself was being warped in its presence. Javier felt his breath catch in his throat. His mind raced, but there was no explanation. No rational thought that could explain the madness of this moment. Scrape. A loud, sickening noise sounded from the back seat. Javier spun in his chair, his heart in his throat. There, sitting in the back of the car, was a figure. It was crouched down, its back bent at an unnatural angle. Its face, twisted and horrific, looked straight at him through the rearview mirror. Its eyes, wide, empty, and black as coal, stared with the intensity of something that had long ago given up on humanity. Its mouth opened, stretching wide, far wider than any human mouth should be able to. The cold air around him seemed to freeze in place, thickening until it felt as if he were underwater, struggling to breathe. The figure's mouth stretched open again, and this time he heard words. "You cannot escape. You never could." The voice was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it tore through the silence with a brutal force, sinking into his very soul. "Please," Javier whispered hoarsely, the words barely escaping his cracked lips. The figure in the back seat tilted its head, its smile widening impossibly. And then, from its mouth came a sound, an unholy guttural noise, like nails on a chalkboard, but deeper, primal, and filled with malice. It reverberated through the car, through the bones of his very being. The car jolted forward suddenly, as though yanked by an invisible force. Javier gasped, his body thrown against the seat, his grip on the wheel lost for a moment. He looked ahead, and for a brief second, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. But then, a sharp crack, the windshield shattered. He gasped, heart hammering. Something had slammed against it, something from the darkness. He couldn't see what it was, but he could feel it now. He could feel it, the presence suffocating, malignant, alive. And that's when he saw it. In the reflection of the broken glass, the figures, no longer just shadows, moved closer. They were outside the car now, surrounding him, their long, twisted forms blotting out what little light the headlights had left. He could hear the sound of their breath, a slow, deliberate inhale, as if they were savoring the final moments of his sanity. Javier slammed the gas pedal with all his might, but the car didn't move. It was as if the road itself was holding him in place, refusing to let him go. The figures in the mirror were getting closer, their eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "You will not leave. You will never leave." The voice came again, this time from all directions. The words wrapped around him, suffocating him. He could no longer hear the hum, the scraping, the growls. It was only the voice now, the terrible, mocking voice that seemed to come from every direction at once. "You will stay here forever. This road is your end. Your fate is sealed. Javier's breath came in shallow gasps. His fingers went limp on the wheel, and his head fell forward, his consciousness slipping into the abyss. And then, just as the final shadow touched the glass, everything went black. Javier had stopped trying to rationalize what was happening. The road, which had once seemed like a simple route to his destination, had now become a maze with no exit. The fog seemed to have a life of its own, wrapping his car in an ever-tightening grip, as though trying to swallow it whole. The headlights illuminated only a few feet ahead, but the sense that something was stalking him remained constant. A dull crack echoed through the car, as if the wheels had run over something heavy, but when Javier looked, all he could see was the fog thick as a blanket of terror. His breath quickened. He was no longer alone. He knew the shadows moving around him were more than just illusions, but something inside him told him not to look, that looking would only make it worse. But he couldn't stop himself. Every time he passed a bend in the road, he could see them. Figures blurred and distorted, walking beside him, their eyes locked on him as though they were waiting. The steering wheel trembled in his hands. The pressure was mounting, as if someone was pushing from the other side. Javier wanted to leave the car, to scream, to run, but his body refused to respond. A sound came from the back seat. A whisper. A woman's voice, barely audible, repeated his name. But it wasn't a gentle whisper. It was one filled with desperation, as though calling from an abyss of eternal pain. The figure in the rearview mirror drew closer. The edges of its form were indistinct, an outline that seemed to shift and distort with every glance. Javier's heart pounded in his chest as he stared, transfixed. There was no escape. The car lurched violently, as though something had taken hold of it from within the fog, dragging it down a path he couldn't see, couldn't avoid. His hands, clammy and stiff, reached for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. The fog had seeped into the vehicle itself, suffocating the air, making each breath harder to take. Javier's pulse throbbed in his temples. The whispers became louder, clearer, until they filled his mind, drowning out all else. "It's too late," the voice said. "You've been chosen." His vision blurred as the figures outside the car pressed closer, their faces distorted, their mouths open in silent screams. The temperature in the car plummeted. He could see his breath in front of him, thick and freezing. The entity in the mirror now loomed so large that it consumed the reflection entirely. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could recognize. In his final moments, Javier understood the truth. He wasn't merely trapped on this road. He was part of it, a sacrifice to something far older and far more terrifying than he could ever comprehend. The ground beneath him seemed to crack open as the car jerked violently. And then, with a final, suffocating breath, Javier was gone. The car came to a halt, the fog slowly dissipating. The road, once so full of dread, now stood empty, silent, as if it had never known the presence of the man who had been foolish enough to drive down it. But if one were to look closely, they would see the faintest outline of a figure at the edge of the fog, still waiting for its next victim. The road, it seemed, was never truly empty.
Every highway hides a story. Dare to follow the shadows? The road was desolate, a lonely stretch of cracked asphalt cutting through miles of fog-draped hills. Jenna drove in silence, the hum of her car's engine the only sound as the clock crept past midnight. She had driven this way countless times before, but tonight the familiar route felt wrong. The fog was thicker than she had ever seen, swallowing her high beams as though the light itself refused to exist here. Her phone had no signal, and the faint outlines of trees along the roadside seemed closer than they should be, leaning in like silent witnesses to her unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The first sign of something strange came when she glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty, but the seatbelt was buckled, the strap lying taut against the fabric as though someone invisible sat beside her. Her stomach twisted. She swerved slightly, her breath catching in her throat. When she looked again, the seatbelt was unbuckled, lying limp and undisturbed. "You're tired," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The fog thickened, and the road began to wind in sharp, unnatural curves. The GPS screen flickered, then went black. Panic prickled at her skin as she realized she didn't recognize this part of the road. She was supposed to be on the main highway, but this stretch was narrower, lined with skeletal trees that reached out with gnarled branches. And then she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Jenna slammed on the brakes, her car skidding to a halt mere feet from the person. Her heart pounded as she strained to see through the fog. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. She didn't move, didn't flinch, even as Jenna rolled down her window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Jenna called, her voice shaking. The woman didn't answer. Slowly she raised one pale arm and pointed down the road, her finger trembling. Jenna's skin crawled. She leaned back, intending to drive around the figure, but when she looked forward again, the road ahead was empty. The woman was gone. Her foot hovered over the accelerator, but something made her hesitate. She glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly screamed. The woman was in the back seat. Jenna turned sharply, but the seat was empty. The silence in the car was suffocating, and her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She gripped the wheel and pressed the gas pedal, determined to get off this cursed road. The whispers started moments later. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once, faint and indistinct. At first she thought it was the wind, but the words grew clearer, forming fragmented phrases that made her blood run cold. "Turn back. Don't follow her. She's waiting." Jenna gritted her teeth and turned on the radio, desperate to drown out the voices, but all she got was static. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became an unbearable cacophony. Suddenly her headlights illuminated a dilapidated bridge ahead, its structure rusted and sagging. The woman was there again, standing at the edge, her arm outstretched as if beckoning Jenna forward. "No," Jenna whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But the car seemed to have a will of its own, pulling her closer to the bridge. Her hands trembled as she tried to turn the wheel, but it wouldn't budge. The engine revved, the speedometer climbing as the vehicle accelerated toward the bridge. The woman's face became clearer as Jenna drew closer. Her eyes were empty sockets, her mouth twisted into a gaping, soundless scream. Jenna pulled the emergency brake, stopping the car just inches from the bridge's edge. Trembling, she watched as the figure vanished into the fog. The whispers stopped. The road was silent again. Shaking, Jenna reversed and turned around, speeding away from the bridge as fast as her car could manage. She didn't care where the road led, as long as it was far from here. When she finally reached civilization hours later, the gas station attendant listened to her story with a knowing look. "That road's been closed for years," he said grimly. "Ever since the accident on the bridge. A woman died there, drove right off the edge one foggy night. They say her spirit tries to lead others to the same fate." Jenna's hands shook as she handed him a few crumpled bills for gas. She drove away without another word, vowing never to take that road again. But as she merged onto the highway, she caught a glimpse of the passenger seatbelt. It was buckled. Sometimes the roads we take are more than just paths to destinations. Some lead us to places we are better off never finding. Take a drive with me down a highway where everything seems wrong from the very start. The night was oppressive, the kind of dark that felt almost tangible, as though the world itself had become smothered under a blanket of black. Sarah had been driving for hours, her headlights barely cutting through the dense fog that had rolled in over the highway. It wasn't unusual for fog to appear late at night, but this felt different. The air was still, almost too still. Not a sound, not even the usual hum of tires against asphalt. Her passenger, Ethan, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We should have turned back," he muttered, glancing out the window at the creeping mist that seemed to cling to everything. Sarah shot him a quick look. "We're almost there. You said this place was easy to find." Ethan didn't reply, his lips pressed into a thin line. The map he'd been following had long since become useless, and the GPS had started malfunctioning the moment they turned onto this road. He could have sworn that the last sign they passed had been miles behind them, but now it seemed as if they were driving on a stretch of road that had no end. The same dark trees lined the edges, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, the fog weaving between them like an unholy presence. "You sure we're not lost?" Ethan asked, his voice a little more anxious now. Sarah didn't answer, her eyes scanning the road ahead. She wasn't sure what to make of the feeling that had crept into her chest. Something in the pit of her stomach gnawed at her, a sense that the highway wasn't just leading them somewhere, but was pulling them there, like a force they couldn't escape. "We'll be fine," Sarah said, her voice more to reassure herself than him. But it wasn't fine. The road ahead began to warp, bending unnaturally. Sarah had driven this highway countless times, but now it seemed as if the pavement had become alive, stretching and twisting as though it was trying to lead them off the path. She squinted ahead, her eyes locking on a dark shape emerging from the fog, a figure standing in the middle of the road. "Sarah, stop!" Ethan shouted. She slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. It was a man, hunched over, his clothes ragged, his face hidden beneath a hood. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then the figure straightened, his head lifting, and their eyes met. But it wasn't his eyes that sent a wave of cold terror through Sarah. It was the hollow emptiness in his gaze, something dark, unfathomable, as if his very being existed in a space beyond her understanding. He didn't speak. He simply raised one hand, pointing down the road. "Do you see that?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah's gaze followed the line of the man's outstretched finger. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, was a building. It looked like an old gas station, the kind you would pass by without a second thought on any other night. But tonight, the very sight of it sent a shiver through her spine. The man took a step back into the fog, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. "I don't like this," Ethan said, his voice low. "We should leave." But Sarah felt a pull, a deep magnetic force, urging her forward towards that gas station. Something about it felt important. Maybe it was the eerie stillness that seemed to permeate the air, or maybe it was the fact that she had to see it for herself, whatever it was. She couldn't explain it. "I'm going," she said, almost mechanically, as if the decision had already been made for her. Ethan tried to protest, but the words caught in his throat. There was something about Sarah's eyes that made him hesitate, something in the way she was staring ahead as though hypnotized. The car rolled forward again, creeping down the road, and the gas station grew closer. When they reached it, the sign above the door flickered weakly, casting a sickly yellow light over the cracked pavement. The pumps were old, rusted, long since abandoned. But what made Sarah's blood run cold wasn't the building. It was the figure standing in the doorway, the man from before. This time his hood was pulled back, revealing a face twisted and pale, skin stretched over sharp, protruding bones. His mouth hung open, as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. His gaze, empty and hollow, locked onto Sarah's as she stopped the car. She should have driven away. She knew that. But the fog thickened, and the world outside seemed to blur, as if the station and the road itself were becoming one. The air in the car was heavy, suffocating. She could barely breathe. "We need to go now," Ethan urged, his voice rising in panic. But it was already too late. The moment Sarah turned the key to drive away, the figure moved, stepping toward the car with an unnatural speed. The headlights flickered, and for a brief, terrible moment, Sarah saw the man's face, grotesque and distorted as he grinned, a grin that seemed too wide, too wrong to belong to any human being. Then everything went dark. The engine sputtered, the lights died, and the car coasted to a stop. Ethan grabbed Sarah's arm, shaking her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, locked on the figure that stood just outside the car. The man's mouth opened again. This time the voice didn't come from him. It came from everywhere, from the fog, from the road, from the very air around them. "Now you're part of it," the voice whispered. and then there was nothing but silence.
It was just past dusk when Martin's headlights first caught the silhouette. He had been driving for hours, winding his way through the back roads, trying to make it home before night completely swallowed the world. Route 47 was quiet, as it always was. The only sounds were the hum of his engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The air outside was thick with the scent of wet earth from a recent rainstorm. The trees on either side of the road stood tall and silent, their outlines barely visible in the growing darkness. Martin had taken this route 100 times before, never expecting anything out of the ordinary. But tonight, something felt off. He couldn't place it, but the uneasy sensation gnawed at him. Maybe it was the rain, or the way the clouds hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Or maybe it was just the fatigue settling into his bones, pushing him closer to the edge of alertness. Either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. And then he saw it, a deer. It stood at the side of the road, motionless, its head turned towards him. Its coat was sleek and dark, blending in with the shadows of the trees. The animal didn't move as his car approached, but its gaze, its eyes, seemed to follow him. The more Martin looked, the more uncomfortable he felt. There was something unnatural about the way it stood there. It was too still, too perfect in the darkness. He tapped the brakes, instinctively slowing down, though there was plenty of space to pass. He didn't want to risk hitting it, of course, but there was something more to it than that. The deer's presence felt like a warning, an omen of something to come. As he neared, the deer's head shifted slightly. It moved as though considering something, as if it had been waiting for him to arrive. And then, without any warning, it stepped into the road. Martin slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the wet asphalt. His heart pounded in his chest as the deer froze in front of him, blocking the entire lane. It was just standing there, unmoving, like it was daring him to come closer. He could see the animal's eyes now, wide and reflecting the headlights, the pupils dilated unnaturally. It didn't look like any deer he'd ever seen before. His gaze wasn't just calm, it was almost calculating. Something about it felt wrong. "Come on, get out of the way," Martin muttered to himself, his voice low and nervous. He honked the horn, hoping to startle the creature into moving, but the deer didn't flinch. It just stood there, its body rigid and unwavering. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Martin wasn't sure what was worse, the silence of the moment or the way the deer stared at him, unblinking. He considered backing up, but the road behind him was narrow, and there was nowhere to turn around. The thought of turning his back on the creature didn't sit well with him, either. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the deer moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a few steps backward, but it didn't leave the road. Instead, it turned its head to the side, its gaze now fixed on something deeper in the trees. Its tail flicked once, then twice, and with that, it stepped aside, just enough for Martin to drive past. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the accelerator, eager to put some distance between himself and the unnerving encounter. But as he passed the deer, something in the woods caught his eye. A shape, a shadow, hidden just beyond the trees. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. For a brief moment, Martin swore he saw something moving in the woods. Something tall, much taller than any man, but too large to be an animal. It was only for an instant, and by the time he looked again, it was gone. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. The rain was coming harder now, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the glass clear. The road ahead felt longer somehow, the darkness pressing in on him. He needed to get home. Minutes passed. Then another curve in the road appeared, and Martin's heart skipped a beat. There, on the side of the road, was the deer once again. It was standing exactly where it had been before, staring at him with those same unsettling eyes. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, something moved, just out of the corner of his eye. Another shape, tall and shadowed. Martin's foot slammed on the brake again, the car screeching as it skidded to a stop. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to focus on what he was seeing. There, just past the deer, was a figure, tall, humanoid, but distorted in a way that didn't make sense. Its body was long, too long, and it seemed to bend in unnatural angles. Its limbs were too thin, almost skeletal, and its head was misshapen, a twisted mockery of a human face. Martin couldn't tear his eyes away, even as his mind screamed at him to drive, to get away. The deer didn't move. It stood perfectly still, like it was waiting for something. Then the figure took a step forward, moving with a fluid grace that shouldn't have been possible for something that large. Martin's hands were shaking as he tried to start the engine, but the car wouldn't respond. The battery was dead. The figure took another step, and another. It was getting closer now, its long limbs reaching toward the car. The deer stood as still as ever, its eyes glowing faintly in the headlights. Martin knew he wasn't going to escape. The air inside the car grew thick, as if the world outside was pressing in, suffocating him. Martin's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but it was drowned out by a deep, low hum, something that seemed to emanate from the figure, a noise not of this world. His hands fumbled for the door handle, but his body refused to move, paralyzed with fear. He could only stare as the figure inched closer, its shape distorting unnaturally with each movement. The deer, once a mere observer, now shifted slightly, its head tilted as though acknowledging the figure's approach. It was no longer the calm, still animal it had once been. Its eyes, now glowing brighter, reflected something darker, something that shouldn't have been seen in the wilds of the world. Martin's mind screamed to run, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. His breathing came in shallow gasps as the figure grew closer, its twisted limbs scraping against the earth like the sound of old wood cracking. The lights of his car flickered. For a moment, they flashed wildly, illuminating the figure in terrifying detail. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow voids of blackness with no reflection, no glint of life. Its skin was mottled and stretched, the texture almost translucent, revealing dark veins snaking beneath. And its face, though it resembled a grotesque human mask, seemed to shift and change, like it was made of 1,000 faces, none of them truly recognizable. A soft, unsettling whisper, like the rustling of leaves, filled the car. Martin didn't understand the words, but they felt like they were meant for him. They pressed against his mind, twisting it into shapes that didn't make sense. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered to life, the engine roaring as if awakened by something ancient, something unseen. Martin slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The tires spun, screeching against the wet asphalt as he jerked the car forward, trying to escape. But it didn't matter how fast he drove. The figure didn't fade into the distance. Behind him, the deer still stood, its silhouette a dark shadow in the rearview mirror. And the figure, he could see it now, even as he sped away, even through the fog and rain, was still there. It was moving with impossible speed, keeping pace with him, as if it were right at his back, its twisted limbs matching every turn. Martin's breath quickened, panic starting to claw at him. The road ahead, once so familiar, now felt like a never-ending stretch of terror. He looked left, right, trying to find a turnoff, an escape. But everything was the same. Trees, darkness, rain. The figure had swallowed the road behind him, and he could feel its presence getting closer with every passing second. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, a sound like the snapping of bones. He didn't know where it came from, but his hands tightened around the steering wheel. He looked up, realizing with horror that the road ahead was changing. The asphalt, once smooth and well-maintained, was now cracked, torn in places, as though something had ripped through it. The trees around him seemed to warp, growing taller and leaning in at unnatural angles. The world itself was shifting, distorting. The deer had disappeared. The figure was still behind him, too close now. Martin could feel it, could feel the cold, oppressive weight of its presence pushing against him, pressing against his very soul. He could hear the whispers again, clearer now, though they were still indecipherable. They weren't words anymore. They were thoughts, fragments of things that should never have been known. A flash of movement caught his eye. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something. A glimpse of a shape in the trees beside him, something tall and dark. But he couldn't focus. He couldn't allow himself to look away from the road. His heart was racing, his vision swimming with terror. Another crack. This time, it came from the front of the car. He slammed on the brakes, but the tires locked. The world outside blurred as the car skidded, the sound of metal scraping against stone ringing in his ears. The car came to a halt, just inches from the edge of the road. In the headlights, the twisted shape of the figure emerged. It was standing right in front of him, its face now inches away from the windshield, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. Its mouth, if it could even be called a mouth, opened slightly, and the words, those terrible, incomprehensible whispers, grew louder, more insistent. Martin couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. The figure's face, now grotesque and misshapen, seemed to melt in front of him, the features shifting like wax under a flame. It leaned closer, its breath foul and hot against the glass, and he could feel it, pulling at the very core of his being. It was close now, too close, and then, without warning, the figure withdrew. The headlights flickered one last time, and the car jerked forward, as if pushed by some unseen force. The world around him spun in chaos, trees warping into shadows, the ground breaking apart. And in that instant, the figure was gone. The road, once cracked and torn, was smooth again. The air was still, the rain slowing to a drizzle. The headlights illuminated the quiet, empty road. The deer was gone, and Martin, he was alone. The silence around Martin was suffocating, a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to weigh on him from all sides. The only sound now was the faint dripping of rain from the trees above, but even that felt distant, like it was happening in another world. He sat frozen in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering in his chest as he struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The world outside the car seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? Martin didn't know. All he knew was that something had changed. The air felt wrong now, thick with an unseen tension. He glanced around, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Just the road, stretching out in front of him, empty and calm. For a moment, he considered just driving away, getting back on the road and leaving whatever nightmare he had just experienced behind. But something, an instinct perhaps, kept him from moving. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, just beyond the edges of his sight, waiting for him to make a mistake. And worse, the sense that it had not truly left. Martin hesitated, then slowly reached for the door handle. His body screamed at him to stay inside, but his mind was louder. He needed to check, needed to know if what he had seen was real. With a deep breath, he opened the door, the cold night air rushing in. His feet hit the ground with a soft thud, and he stood, his legs weak beneath him. The world felt off-kilter, as though the ground itself was subtly shifting. The trees around him swayed unnaturally, their branches bending in odd directions. The road, which had seemed so familiar before, now looked distorted, as though it was part of a dream or a nightmare. Martin's head spun with the realization that the landscape around him no longer made sense. The horizon had no end. The trees were too tall, their shadows too long. The night sky seemed too dark, too oppressive. He was no longer sure where the road was leading, or if it had ever been real. And then he heard it, a low, guttural noise, coming from the woods on his left. It was like the sound of something large dragging itself through the underbrush, something moving with unnatural force. His breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively took a step back toward the car. His mind screamed for him to get back inside, to lock the doors and drive away, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He stood frozen, listening, the air thick with dread. The sound grew louder, closer. There was no mistaking it now. Something was moving in the trees. Something huge, something deliberate. Martin's eyes darted around, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything clearly. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the air grew colder. He felt the weight of something watching him, waiting, and then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The forest fell quiet again, but the silence felt even more suffocating than before. Martin's heart was racing now, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't know what to do. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground. He glanced at the car, but the headlights were still on, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Suddenly, a sharp crack sounded from behind him. The noise was so loud it made him jump, his heart skipping a beat. He spun around, eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sounds, just the stillness of the dark forest. Then he saw it. A shape, no, something, standing just at the edge of the road. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its form seemed to shimmer in the dim light from the car. It was hard to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was too tall, too lanky, too wrong. The way it stood there, unmoving, was enough to make Martin's blood run cold. The shape didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but Martin knew it was watching him, its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on him. He felt it in his bones. He could feel its presence, just beyond his line of sight, lurking in the darkness. His breath hitched as a cold gust of wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves around him. The figure remained motionless, but something about it felt alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to move. Martin's heart pounded louder in his chest, each beat seeming to echo through the stillness of the night. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run, to get away, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in place, frozen in fear, unable to tear his eyes away from the shape. Suddenly, it moved. The motion was impossibly fast, blurring with speed as it closed the distance between them in an instant. Martin barely had time to react before the thing was right in front of him, standing so close that he could feel its presence like a physical weight. The air grew colder still, and for the briefest of moments, their gazes locked. The figure's face was indistinguishable in the shadows, but Martin could feel the hatred radiating from it, thick and palpable. It was a thing that should not exist in the world, something born from nightmares, a creature beyond comprehension. And just like that, it was gone. The world around Martin snapped back to normal, the figure vanishing into the night like smoke, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. The trees were still, the wind had stopped, and the road was quiet again. But Martin knew that whatever he had just experienced wasn't over. The figure had gone, yes, but it had not left. And it would be back. It always would. The question was, when? Martin stood still, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. The world around him seemed too quiet now, too still, as though the very air had been sucked out of the night. His mind screamed at him to run, to get in the car and leave this place, but his body refused to move. Every part of him was locked in place, unable to process what had just happened. He glanced over his shoulder toward the car, the headlights still shining brightly into the darkness. The road was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind, their leaves rustling in the distance. It almost seemed like everything was normal again, like the thing that had just been standing in front of him had been some twisted figment of his imagination. But Martin knew better than to trust his eyes now. The unease gnawed at him from the inside out. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching him from the shadows. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, a cold, nauseating sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. His mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. That shape so tall, so unnatural, and the way it had moved so impossibly fast, as if it had bent the very laws of nature. It had been like a shadow, but it had been real, and it had been aware. He wasn't imagining it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some trick of the mind. It was something real, something that lived in the dark corners of the world. He couldn't stay here, not like this. Slowly, his legs began to move, and he turned back toward the car. The rain had started to fall heavier now, drumming against the roof of the car in a rhythmic patter, as if to remind him of the world he was still connected to. He reached for the door handle with trembling fingers, but just as his hand brushed against it, a noise stopped him dead in his tracks. A sound, faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but unmistakable. It was a scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground. Something heavy, something slow. It was coming from behind him. Martin's breath hitched, his blood turning to ice. He didn't dare turn around. He didn't want to see whatever it was, didn't want to acknowledge the terror creeping up his spine. But the sound was getting closer, dragging closer, like something was stalking him from the woods. A low, guttural sound, as though something was struggling to move. His legs finally responded to the instinct to flee. He threw open the door and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming it shut behind him. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys in his pocket, his mind racing. He could hear the scraping now, unmistakable and unrelenting, as though whatever it was right behind the car. He turned the ignition, the engine sputtering to life, and slammed his foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires spinning on the wet road. Martin's breath came in ragged bursts as he sped down the road, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. The world behind him was nothing but rain and shadows, but the scraping noise had stopped. It was almost as if the thing had let him go, as if it was waiting for something. He couldn't bring himself to look back. His foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, pushing the car faster as the trees blurred past. He needed to get away. He didn't know where the road was taking him anymore. He just needed to get away from this place, from whatever had been lurking in the woods. The rain fell in sheets now, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The headlights barely illuminated the road ahead of him, but it didn't matter. He couldn't focus on the road anymore. His mind kept drifting back to the woods, to that thing, to the sound that had followed him. It was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. But as Martin drove, something in the distance caught his attention. A shape, something just barely visible through the veil of rain. It was standing at the edge of the road, right where the trees thinned out, right where the curve of the road led into a narrow, dark tunnel. His heart skipped a beat. It was a deer, a large, dark shape, standing still in the middle of the road. Its body was unnaturally still, too still. The rain glistened on its coat, but there was something wrong about it. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty black voids, hollow and unblinking, staring straight into Martin's. For a brief moment, Martin wondered if he was hallucinating. But as he got closer, he saw that the deer didn't move. It didn't even flinch as the car barreled toward it. The headlights illuminated its dark, empty gaze, and Martin slammed his foot on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching as the vehicle jerked to a halt just inches from the deer. Martin's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He could hear the steady drip of rain on the roof, the only sound breaking the heavy silence that had enveloped the car. And then, to his horror, the deer began to move. Not in the way a deer should, not with the graceful, fluid motion of an animal running or jumping. No, the deer's movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling to keep itself upright. Its head tilted to the side, and it began to slowly walk toward the car, its hooves scraping against the wet pavement with that same terrible dragging noise he had heard earlier. Martin's breath caught in his throat, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The deer didn't blink, didn't look away. Its black eyes were locked on him, unwavering, as it drew closer. The air in the car seemed to grow colder. The rain didn't seem to touch the windshield anymore. All that mattered, all that existed in that moment, was the deer and its hollow gaze. He could feel the panic rising in his chest as the thing drew closer. Every instinct in his body told him to drive away, to escape this nightmare. But the car wouldn't move. The engine was still running, but the car remained motionless. It was as if the deer had stopped him, trapped him in place. Martin's breathing became shallow as the creature reached the front of the car. Its head tilted farther to one side, and it leaned in close to the windshield. The smell of wet earth and decay filled the air, nauseating and thick. And then the deer spoke. "You're mine now." The words were so low, so guttural, that Martin almost didn't believe his own ears. But they echoed in his mind, louder than any sound he had ever heard. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his fingers ached, but the world around him was already slipping away. Martin's pulse raced as he stared at the creature, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The words that had come from its mouth weren't natural. They weren't the words of an animal, and they weren't the words of anything human. It was as if the very air around him had thickened with a malevolent presence, suffocating him with its weight. The deer's black eyes never wavered. It stood just inches from the windshield, its breath fogging up the glass as it leaned closer. The low, guttural growl it emitted seemed to vibrate in his chest, reverberating like the sound of distant thunder. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on in agonizing slow motion. The only sound Martin could hear was his own shallow breathing and the deafening silence of the night around him. "You're mine now," the words echoed in his mind, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He had to get out of there. He had to drive away to escape whatever this thing was. But his body didn't respond. His fingers were frozen on the steering wheel, his foot still pressed against the brake. The car paralyzed as if some invisible force had taken hold of it. He glanced back at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something else lurking behind him, something worse than the creature in front of him. But the road was empty. The rain blurred the view, and the darkness beyond the headlights swallowed everything in its grasp. The deer took another slow step forward, its hooves scraping against the pavement, dragging the horrible, dragging sound that seemed to rattle his bones. Martin's throat went dry as his eyes locked onto the creature's face, unable to look away. He couldn't tell if it was still a deer. No, not anymore. It was something else. Something dark, something ancient. The creature's mouth curled upward into a grotesque, twisted smile that sent a jolt of pure terror through his body. And then, as if responding to his terror, the car shook. Just a subtle tremor at first, but it quickly grew in intensity, rattling the windows and sending a wave of dread through Martin's entire being. The dashboard flickered, and the lights dimmed. Without thinking, Martin slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as it shot away from the deer, but the world around him didn't change. The road blurred past, but something was wrong. The road, the trees, the rain, it all looked the same. The landscape was shifting, warping, but it was all the same. Endless, dark, and empty. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he glanced frantically around. The headlights barely cut through the darkness anymore. The rain seemed to have intensified, turning into a torrential downpour that obscured everything beyond the windshield. But then he saw it, a set of eyes, two glowing, black orbs staring back at him from the side of the road. A second deer. No, it wasn't a deer. It was something else. It stood motionless in the shadows, hidden just enough that he could see only the outline of its dark, twisted body. The eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and he could feel them watching him, waiting. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He drove faster. He had to get away. This wasn't real. None of it was real. He had to be dreaming, or he was hallucinating from the exhaustion, from the fear, from everything. He couldn't afford to look at it. He couldn't afford to stop. But as his gaze darted back to the road ahead, another figure appeared. The third, and another. They were scattered along the roadside, each with those same glowing eyes, staring at him with a hunger he couldn't even begin to fathom. The road was no longer just a road. It was a trap that he had driven into, and he couldn't escape. The car sputtered, its engine coughing and stalling. Panic surged through him, and he slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, but nothing happened. The car had stopped. The creatures in the shadows were closer now, surrounding him on all sides. He could see them better now, their forms shifting and contorting in ways that no living creature should be able to move. They were tall, impossibly tall, their limbs elongated, like twisted reflections of something that had once been alive. Their eyes were hollow and empty, yet full of a cold, predatory hunger. Their mouths parted in silent screams, their gaping jaws filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. One of them stepped forward, its elongated fingers scraping across the side of the car. It didn't make a sound, but Martin could feel its presence pressing in on him. His pulse pounded in his ears, the fear choking him. "You're not leaving." The voice came from all around him, a chorus of low, rumbling growls and whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls of the car. The world outside the windows darkened, the shadows closing in. Martin pressed his hands against the wheel, desperate to escape, to do anything. But his body had gone numb. He couldn't move. The creatures were closer now, and their hollow eyes bore into him like 1,000 pinpricks of ice. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones. The rain pounded against the car, and in the thick darkness, something moved in the back seat. Martin's breath caught in his throat as the sound from the back seat grew louder. A soft scraping, almost like the sound of fingernails dragging across fabric. He couldn't turn around, couldn't bring himself to face whatever it was, yet he could feel its presence pressing in, inch by inch. His fingers trembled against the steering wheel as he glanced at the rearview mirror, half afraid to look. The empty reflection mocked him, offering no answers, only a deeper silence that clawed at his mind. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to move, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the uncertainty of what waited behind him. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. He was no longer alone. Martin's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the road stretched out in front of him, endless and unfamiliar. The creatures, those twisted beings with their glowing eyes, had closed in further, standing just inches away from the car. He could see their silhouettes shifting, their unnatural forms twitching with something far beyond human comprehension. Suddenly, the backseat door creaked open. Slowly, the metal scraping against metal seemed to echo through his skull, and his heart thundered in his chest. Don't look back. But it was no use. His body moved before he could stop it. He twisted his head, eyes wide in terror as he saw it. What was once a shadow, now fully formed. It was crouched in the back seat, hunched over, with those same black, soulless eyes staring directly at him. Its face, if it could even be called that, was pale, almost sickly, its skin stretched taut over bone. The mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth, sharp and glinting in the dim light. It wasn't human. It never had been. The car jolted again, this time not from the engine's failure, but from the force of something slamming into the vehicle's side. The sound of metal bending and screeching filled the cabin, and Martin felt the car shift sideways. His heart leapt into his throat as the pressure mounted, the weight of something immense pushing against the vehicle. The creature in the back seat hissed, a low, guttural sound that made Martin's skin crawl. It tilted its head slightly, as though inspecting him, its black eyes narrowing. "Leave, now," it whispered, its voice rasping, not quite human, not quite animal. The words sent a chill through his entire being, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Martin felt the overwhelming pull of terror, a primal urge to flee, to escape whatever this was. He yanked the gear shift into drive, slamming his foot down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward again, its wheels screeching against the wet pavement. But the pressure from the side didn't relent. The creatures, if that's what they were still there, pushing against him. He could feel the car being forced off the road, its tires struggling to find grip. The headlights flickered erratically as if the world itself was turning against him. Rain lashed at the windshield in sheets, blurring the road ahead until he couldn't see anything at all. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, the kind that made the world seem smaller, more suffocating. He couldn't stop. He couldn't give in. But the more he fought against the pull of the road, the stronger it seemed to grow. The creatures weren't just on the outside. They were inside his mind, scratching at the edges of his sanity. They had been following him, stalking him from the moment he had driven down this twisted path, and now they were inside, like a virus infecting his thoughts. The world around him started to warp. The trees on the side of the road began to twist and bend, their shapes shifting into grotesque forms, like unnatural faces stretching toward him. The rain intensified, hammering against the car like nails driven into wood. The darkness outside deepened, suffocating the world in a black void. Suddenly, the creature in the back seat lunged forward with inhuman speed, its claws scraping across the seat as it pressed closer. Martin's heart exploded in his chest as he slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, the tires grinding to a stop as the creature's face came inches from his own, its putrid breath fogging up the glass. "You can't run forever," it whispered, its voice like a wet rasp against his ear. Martin's body went cold. There was no escaping, no way out. The road stretched endlessly, twisting and curling in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The creatures were everywhere, everywhere in the fog, in the trees, on the road, in his mind. The car shuddered again as something heavy crashed against the roof, followed by a deafening crack. The roof caved in slightly, the metal bending under the pressure. Panic surged through him as he realized he was no longer in control. Something clawed at the door, pulling at it, trying to get inside. The door handle snapped off with a sickening crack, and the metal groaned as if the car itself were screaming. Every instinct told him to run, but there was no place to run to, no place to hide. The creature's clawed hand slowly reached across the seat, its fingers curling toward him. Martin's breath was caught in his throat as he reached for the door handle, but his body was frozen in place. It was happening again. It was happening, and this time there was no escape. The creature's fingers brushed against Martin's shoulder, sending a sharp chill through his body. He could feel the heat of its touch seeping through his jacket, its grip tightening as if to pull him into the nightmare that awaited him outside. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a thunderous echo in his ears. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go, as the world around him collapsed into a blur of darkness and chaos. The creature's other hand emerged, clawing at the seat, its eyes glowing brighter now, burning with a hunger that seemed insatiable. Martin tried to push the door open, but it was locked. Panic set in, his breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. His hands trembled as they searched for the keys in his pocket, the metal digging into his skin. He didn't even hear the click of the ignition turning over until the engine roared back to life, the engine sputtering and coughing as it tried to power up. But before he could make any move to drive, the creature pressed its face against the window. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, the jagged teeth clattering against the glass, and its breath fogged up the surface. "You should have stayed away," it hissed. The words sent a wave of dread through Martin, but before he could react, the car lurched violently to the side again, and the world outside seemed to warp in ways that didn't make sense. The rain came down in sheets, but it wasn't water. It was dark, viscous, and thick, like tar falling from the sky. His wipers struggled against the sticky substance as it smeared across the glass, making it harder to see. The road, if it could still be called that, wasn't the same. It had become something else, twisting into an unrecognizable labyrinth that made no sense. The trees were bent and deformed, their trunks gnarled and clawed, like the hands of some forgotten god trying to reach into his world. Martin's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and the car screamed down the road, tires sliding across the wet surface as he tried to control it. The fog rolled in thicker, smothering everything around him, and the darkness grew deeper, like a living thing trying to swallow him whole. In the rearview mirror, Martin saw movement. Something small, something creeping toward him. His eyes widened in horror as he caught a glimpse of it. A twisted, contorted version of what once was a deer. Its body was unnaturally long, its legs bent in ways that couldn't possibly be natural. Its face, no, its head, was a mess of broken, jagged bone and skin, hollowed eyes staring into the rearview mirror with a soul-shattering emptiness. It was following him. No, it was more than that. It was hunting him. "Turn around," the voice from the back seat whispered again, this time louder, more forceful. His eyes darted to the mirror. The creature was gone, but its reflection lingered. That twisted deer was there, its eyes gleaming in the mist like two burning embers. It had crossed the road. Somehow it had shifted, crossed from one side to the other impossibly fast, almost like it had never been bound by the laws of reality. "Turn around." The voice seemed to resonate through his head now, not just in his ears. It was everywhere. It was in the air, in the tires, in the rain falling in sheets. It was seeping into him, crawling under his skin. "Turn around." Martin's hands tightened on the wheel. His breath caught in his throat as the urge to look back intensified. His foot hovered over the brake. For a split second, he thought he could feel the grip of the creature's claws again, the pressure of it bearing down on him. The road stretched on endlessly, winding and curling. He couldn't turn back. He couldn't. The wiper blades scraped across the windshield as if fighting a battle against the tar-like rain. He glanced at the side mirror. The road was empty, but the fear gnawing at him, relentless, palpable, told him otherwise. A sudden crash of thunder split the air. Martin slammed on the brakes, the car jolting to a halt. There, in front of him, stood the deer. No, it wasn't a deer anymore. It was something else, something far worse. The creature's body seemed to melt and shift, elongating and twisting, bones cracking in ways they shouldn't have. Its grotesque form now much larger than it ever should have been. Its head, that twisted mockery of an animal's face, turned slowly toward him, its eyes gleaming with malice. The car stalled. The lights flickered. Everything in the world slowed, as if time had stopped just for this moment. The deer, no, whatever it had become, started to move toward him, its twisted legs dragging across the road, splintering the asphalt as it came closer. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice now something more ancient, something far older than he could understand. Martin's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His hands were slick with sweat, his body frozen in place. And then the world began to crumble. The ground beneath him cracked, the earth splitting open as the creature lunged forward, its twisted form now so close he could hear the rasp of its breath against the night air. The creature's presence felt like an oppressive force, its twisted body casting long shadows across the car as it crawled closer. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if savoring the fear it was instilling in Martin. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the once crisp sound of the rain hitting the car was now drowned by an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint scratching of its claws against the asphalt. Martin's heart thudded loudly in his chest, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bring himself to move. His foot, seemingly of its own volition, pressed against the gas pedal. But the car didn't budge. The creature's head tilted, its grotesque eyes narrowing as it studied him. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely, each second feeling like an eternity as it inched closer, its body elongating unnaturally with every step. "You've come too far," it whispered again, the voice a hiss that resonated deep within Martin's mind. The words felt like poison, slipping into his thoughts, twisting them, manipulating them. Suddenly, the car lurched forward on its own, tires spinning as the creature closed the gap. The engine roared in protest, the headlights flickering erratically as they lit up the twisted form of the creature, its skin glistening in the dim light like wet leather. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the ground as it moved closer, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. Martin's fingers twitched on the wheel, trying to regain control, but his body felt like lead, his limbs frozen in place. The creature was mere feet away now. Its breath fogged up the windshield, and its clawed hand reached out, tapping against the glass as though testing its limits. The wipers continued to swipe frantically, the tar-like rain blurring his vision even further. He could barely make out the shape of the thing, but the eyes, they were the most terrifying part. There was something ancient and malevolent behind those hollow, black pits. They seemed to promise endless torment, a fate far worse than death. With a sudden burst of strength, Martin slammed his foot onto the gas pedal. The car shot forward, its tires screeching in protest, but it didn't matter. He had to get away. The car sped down the road, the engine roaring louder than before, but every turn, every curve, only seemed to make things worse. The road had warped once again. The trees that lined the sides were now distorted, twisted into grotesque shapes that reached out like monstrous hands. The road, once a clear path, now seemed to twist in impossible directions, narrowing and widening at random. The creature, however, wasn't far behind. Its movements were unnatural, as though it was both there and not there at the same time. One moment it was closing in on him from the left, and the next it appeared in the rearview mirror, its eyes locked onto his. The distance between them was closing, and no matter how fast he drove, it seemed to be matching his speed, relentless in its pursuit. The world outside the car was no longer a familiar road. It had turned into a nightmare, an endless expanse of dark, oppressive trees and twisted, distorted paths. The sky was an unnatural shade of black, swirling with storm clouds that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Panic surged through Martin's chest as he glanced at the gas gauge. It was nearing empty. He could see the glow of the red warning light flickering in the corner of his eye, a cruel reminder that time was running out. He couldn't outrun it forever. Desperation crept into his mind, and he knew that if he didn't find a way out soon, there would be no escape. The creature, though invisible to the naked eye at times, was still there, lurking just behind him, breathing heavily, waiting. It was relentless, its presence a constant weight on his shoulders. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the road ahead of him began to distort further, twisting in on itself until the asphalt became a writhing mass of tar and broken stone. The headlights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the trees that seemed to move with a life of their own. The trees swayed in a rhythm, as if they were breathing. He slammed his foot on the brake, the car skidding as it tried to stop, but the road had turned into something impossible, a living thing that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The tires couldn't grip onto the shifting surface. He was spiraling, falling into the darkness, and there was no escape. Suddenly, everything around him went still. A deafening silence settled over the car. The engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering out completely, leaving Martin in total darkness. His breath quickened in the pitch black, the shadows around him seemingly growing thicker, pressing in. In the utter silence, the sound of breathing, slow, ragged, and deep, filled the car. It wasn't his breath. It wasn't his own. The air grew colder, the chill crawling down his spine. He could feel something in the darkness, something right behind him, waiting. The breath was so close now that it felt like a cold gust against his neck. His skin crawled, and his eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing there. Only the oppressive blackness. A soft, low growl echoed from behind him, sending a surge of terror through his body. It was then that he realized he had been wrong. It had never been about outrunning it. It was always about surviving the waiting. The growl intensified, vibrating the very core of Martin's being. It was a low, guttural sound, the kind that rattles your bones and makes your skin crawl. His heart thumped loudly in his chest, drowning out all other sound, as he tried to push open the door of the car. But his hands shook so violently he couldn't grip the handle. The cold breath on his neck was becoming unbearable now, like ice sinking into his flesh. A presence, darker than any shadow, pressed against him, and he knew. It was inside the car now. The darkness around him wasn't just the absence of light. It was an entity, something far older than human understanding, something that thrived on fear, on panic. Suddenly, the car jolted, shaking violently as though something enormous was scraping along the sides. The metal screamed in protest, the sound searing through the air like nails on a chalkboard. Martin's panic surged into overdrive. He had to get out. He had to survive. Desperate, he lunged for the handle again, this time succeeding. The door flew open, slamming into the side of the car as he scrambled out. The world outside the car was no better. The road had completely disappeared. He was standing on a cracked surface, blackened and charred, stretching endlessly into the horizon. The air was thick with fog, swirling with strange, faint whispers, his name, echoing from all directions. He tried to run, his legs unresponsive, as though they were bound by some invisible force. His feet stumbled over jagged stones, and the fog swallowed him whole. But the growl, that horrible, deep growl, was still there. It wasn't behind him anymore. It was all around him. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed again, and this time it was unmistakably coming from the fog itself. It wrapped around his mind, his thoughts, pulling them apart as he tried to focus on anything other than the growing sense of dread. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, his eyes darting wildly around, searching for any sign of escape. And that's when he saw it, the eyes. They weren't glowing, but they burned like holes in the very fabric of reality. At first, just one pair, then another and another, dozens of them staring at him from the fog. They were not animal eyes, not human. They were eyes of something else, something ancient, something hungry. The presence was everywhere now. The ground beneath his feet trembled as the fog thickened, swirling violently around him. The temperature dropped, and the hairs on his neck stood straight up. He was no longer alone. He was surrounded by darkness, and it was waiting. With a final, defiant scream, Martin turned and ran, his legs barely moving, as though the very air itself was trying to slow him down. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his mind, drowning out all reason. The fog closed in faster, the dark eyes watching him, waiting for him to slip. And then, just as he thought he couldn't run any longer, the ground beneath him gave way. His body fell weightless for a moment, before crashing into something soft and cold. He tried to scream, but the air was gone, suffocated by an invisible force pressing down on him. His arms flailed, but the darkness closed in around him, pushing him deeper into a cold, empty void. The last thing he felt before everything went still, before his mind faded to nothing, was the chilling touch of something cold against his skin. The fog swallowed him whole, and the road was silent once again. The end.